You never think anything like this will happen to you or to the people you know. This is one of those stories when the life of your dreams turns into your worst nightmare. Only this time, it's one that no one will wake up from. This story takes place in September 2005 in a town called Neal. It's a western suburb 45 minutes outside Chicago in DuPage County, Illinois. Neal is described as very family-oriented. It's also pretty upscale. Many people relocate to this area when they raise a family due to the quality schools. There are also a lot of parks and recreation areas, and it's just great for active families. It's just a really safe neighborhood. It's not like Chicago. There's a very low crime rate and a particularly low murder rate. There are no gangs, drive-bys in the street, or violence like you see elsewhere in Illinois. The story is going to be centered around a West suburban all-American family. It's almost like the classic fairy tale phrase, happily ever after. It really originated from the basic white heterosexual couple with American ideals. But can we really use this term the way it originated with the evolution of what an American family looks like now? You tell me. However, it's also said that if you describe someone as all-American, it means that they seem to have all the typical qualities that are valued by ordinary Americans: good looks, higher education, wealth, success, etc. So I think it definitely describes the Hanson family. Mary Lynn and Terrence Hanson had 2 daughters and a son. They were wealthy and had good jobs. Terry was successful in sales, working for the same company for over 30 years. Mary was a devoted wife and mother. She managed the household, spent time gardening, organizing, entertaining guests, and raising their children. They had a big, beautiful home. It's right here, a loving marriage, and 3 beautiful children. Everyone that knew the Hansons said they were living a great life and had everything they could possibly want. Stories always seem to start out like this. Taryn Michael Hanson, who went by Terry, was born on September 18, 1948, in Minneapolis, Minnesota. As a young man, he served in the Navy Reserve. He met Mary in high school in the 60s, and they became high school sweethearts. After high school, they got married. Terry was a hard worker. He loved to golf in his off time and spent a lot of time golfing with his friends. He was also a huge Vikings fan and enjoyed watching sports and spending time with his family. Mary Lynn Hanson, who I will refer to as Mary, was born on July 14, 1950, also in Minneapolis, Minnesota. After she and Terry got married, they wanted to start a family right away. In 1970, their first child was born, and they named her Jennifer. They did stay in Minnesota for a few years, but ended up moving to various states due to Terry's job. They were living in New Jersey when they had their second daughter, Catherine Kate. She was born on August 27, 1974, in Morristown, New Jersey. Finally, they had their third child, and this time it was a boy, Eric Hanson. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia, on November 22, 1976, just a few days before Thanksgiving, and he was the Hansons' last child. Mary was known as the Martha Stewart of her friend group. She had an eye for fashion, design, and decorating. She was a perfectionist when it came to party planning and loved getting their friends together for games of bridge and cards at their house all the time. Terry and Mary were opposites as much as they were compatible. For example, during one of their regular bridge parties, Mary stepped away for just a moment and asked Terry to watch the fish that was cooking on the grill. In only a matter of minutes, sounds like something that would happen to me, he got carried away in a conversation. When Mary came back and opened the grill, there was nothing there except charcoal, and they would joke about this all the time. Mary was always offering to help. She would even redecorate her friends' homes and give them beauty advice. She was one of those friends who would come over, bring you soup when you were sick, and by the time she left, your whole house would be rearranged, organized, and cleaned from top to bottom. Terry was known as a charming, handsome man with a great sense of humor, and he loved to tease the people closest to him. A phrase that he used a lot was, "Don't get mad, get even." This reflected his work ethic. He was hardly ever seen without a laptop or his phone. He was always working and multitasking. He could draft up contracts while watching the children and be on a business call at the same time. He loved his job and was a devoted family man. Eventually, the Hansons decided to move to Neal, Illinois. When the children had graduated from high school, Jennifer decided to stay back in Minnesota. She ended up getting married to a man named Corey Williams, and they had 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, just like her mom. Kate and Eric moved to Illinois with Terry and Mary, and they were very attentive parents. They went above and beyond for all of their children. All 3 of them were positioned to have opportunities to get whatever they desired in life, and their parents were there to help. Kate was very close with her mother and took after her in many ways. Kate enjoyed going shopping with her mom, decorating the house, and throwing parties for special occasions with friends and family. She was also known for her very strong political views. She attended Aurora University, graduating in 2003 with a degree in political science. She was a staunch Republican and a huge fan of Bill O'Reilly. She would frequently call into his radio show. She looked up to women like Laura Bush. She even spotted her once at a restaurant while she was visiting New York and became so giddy that she shouted out loud with joy. Kate also liked expensive luxury fashion. She had a very large collection of designer purses, specifically Louis Vuitton bags. Her aunt would joke that while they were on a trip to Paris, Kate spent way more time shopping for bags than she did enjoying the tourist attractions. While in college, she worked as a waitress at an upscale steakhouse called Sullivan's in downtown Neal. This is where she met her future husband, James "Jimmy" Sa. Jimmy was actually on a date with another woman, but Kate made such an impression on him that he slipped away from the table and asked for her phone number. He also impressed her by giving her a very generous tip. He did not hesitate to call Kate the very next day, and they went out that same night. From that moment on, they never left each other's sides. They really felt like they were meant for one another. Jimmy came to the US from Taiwan with his brother Kiyoshi when he was only in 6th grade. He was very ambitious and owned and operated a company called TT Incorporated, which imported and exported computer equipment between the US and Taiwan, where his parents still lived. Jimmy's brother also worked for his company. Jimmy was making money from a very young age and never left home without carrying a lot of cash. Just like Kate, he enjoyed the finer things in life. He was into trading and investing, and even had a collection of gold bars in his house. About 8 months after Kate and Jimmy met, they eloped in Vegas, but kept their marriage under wraps for a while because they planned a very elaborate, fancy, huge celebration in the spring of 2006 on a boat off of Navy Pier. After they were married, they got this big, gorgeous 2-story home in a community called White Eagle. The subdivision was only 5 miles away from the Hansons' residence. Look how beautiful it is. I love the brick. It had 5 bedrooms, 3 baths, and over 3,000 square feet. The couple enjoyed dining out, going to the movies, and spending time with Kate's family, especially Mary. Their home was in an upscale, quiet, gated community. It was immaculate, lined with well-manicured lawns and fancy homes, and even boasted 24-hour security with officers on patrol. Jimmy regularly played poker with other guys in the neighborhood. They were all very friendly and looked out for one another. If anyone needed anything, they were there to help. Kate and Jimmy were in love. They had the same goals and were both family-oriented. They looked forward to starting a family of their own together, and Kate was actually helping Jimmy with his company. She was working as an administrative assistant. The family stayed close even though they were in different states. She loved spending time with Jennifer's children. She adored her 2 nieces and nephew. When Terry and Mary moved to Naperville, they met another couple, Ron Olin and his wife Andy, and the 4 of them really hit it off. They had a very close friendship. They considered each other family. They spoke every day. Ron also knew the Hanson children pretty well. He said that Mary and Terry would do anything for their children. Out of all the kids, Mary was the closest to Eric and Terry was the closest to Kate. Daddy's girl and mama's boy, perhaps. Mary was known to spoil Eric, and I think most parents are somewhat guilty of that, especially when it's the baby of the family. The last born is the last chance to be the best parent, and in some cases, parents will overcompensate for anything they regret doing or not doing with their previous kids. Mary doted on Eric since he was born. Eric was growing up at a time when his parents were the wealthiest they had ever been. Therefore, he did tend to get more material things that he wanted. They went on vacations, they had big Sunday night dinners with their friends, and he was gifted things like cars and nice clothes. I think you get the picture. However, Eric was a handful. They say the boys are. I have a girl, so I don't have first-hand experience, but moms that I have talked to say that boys are just naturally more rambunctious. With Terry at work all the time, it was really hard for Mary to handle all 3 kids, with Eric being the hardest. She just wanted Eric to be calmer like the girls were, and by the time he was only 18 months old, Mary thought there might be something wrong with him. In this next part, I will be discussing mental health, specifically ADHD, and even more specifically, ADHD in children. I'm not an expert, but I know enough about ADHD to understand it. But before this video, I had never gone deep into how it may affect children. And by the way, if you're not interested in this part of the video concerning mental health, you can skip ahead. I will leave the timestamp below. However, I usually don't include topics that aren't relevant to the story, so I do encourage you to listen. Mary brought Eric in to be evaluated by a physician who ended up referring her to a child psychologist. After fully evaluating Eric, it was the doctor's professional opinion that Mary tried medication with him. Keep in mind he's not even 2 years old at this point. I'm going to present you with the facts that I've gathered, and you can make your own judgment call and opinion, and I will give you my thoughts as well. If you have ADHD, or you have a child that suffers with it or takes meds or was misdiagnosed, just any experience, leave it in the comments because it always leads to interesting conversations. But remember, be kind, considerate, and mature. I've heard about children taking medication at a young age, but I guess I never considered it at only 18 months or even kindergarten age. It just seems so young to me. As a matter of fact, children can develop the same mental health conditions as adults, but their symptoms may be different. And apparently there are things to look out for. I wanted to define mental health disorders in children. Generally speaking, it refers to delays in developing age-appropriate thinking, behavior, social skills, and regulation of emotions, which can be very hard for children. It can make it hard for them to function at school, at home, or in social situations. But here's the thing. It's hard to differentiate between a disorder versus normal childhood behavior. That's the trouble I have with this topic. Kids are changing, they're learning, they're not little adults, they can't always think for themselves, and left to their own devices, many children are just children. They're immature, they make bad decisions, basically, they don't know the stove will burn them, so to speak. I tend to lean more toward children not learning coping skills, or even before that knowing right from wrong, as well as the consequences of their actions. And therefore they start to exhibit this unwanted behavior, and then it turns into a habit over time, which is then harder to curb. Unbeknownst to me before researching this thoroughly, there are actually a litany of common disorders that appear in childhood, which makes sense because they have to start at some point, right? Anxiety disorders, ADHD, autism, eating disorders, depression, mood disorders, PTSD, schizophrenia, and I'm sure that is not even close to an exhaustive list. But there are also warning signs: persistent sadness, hurting oneself or talking about hurting oneself, talking about death or suicide, outbursts of extreme irritability, out-of-control behavior that can sometimes be harmful, drastic changes in mood or changes in personality or behavior, or even their eating habits, loss of weight, difficulty sleeping, frequent headaches or stomach aches, difficulty concentrating, changes in academic performance, or just trying to avoid or miss school. Tell me this, would these apply to an 18-month-old baby? The child isn't even 2, and we always say, terrible 2s. That became a thing because of the way children act at 2. Not to mention that not all children act out. So if you're comparing them to another sibling, you might think they're truly broken or suffering from a disorder. But are they? What are your thoughts? Here's the thing. Inattention, impulsivity, overactivity, they're all common in ADHD, but they're also common in the daily behaviors of most preschool-age children. Studies have shown that up to 40% of children by the age of 4 already have sufficient problems with paying attention. And when you add technology to the mix, that number is probably going to go up. Now, nevertheless, The majority of these concerns don't last long term, although we may not know about the technology thing right now. Anyway, even children who have symptoms that are so severe and frequent that they warrant a diagnosis of ADHD in the preschool years, only 48% of them continue to exhibit these behaviors into adolescence. Research has concluded that most of these behaviors alone by 3- and 4-year-olds are not indicative of ADHD, especially since 50% of all preschool children have the same characteristics. But let's say a child really is suffering, and taking into account that these disorders would actually negatively affect the child, it makes sense to try proven methods to improve the quality of life, not just for the children but for the parents. Mary took Eric to mental health professionals, whose job it is to diagnose these disorders. If the professionals were saying medication was the best course of action, I'm going to assume it was. But I can tell you from personal experience working at a doctor's office, there are incentives for prescribing meds to patients, especially young ones. Some say there's a plan for pharmaceutical companies to get people hooked at a young age. That way you get a patient for life. And I'm not going to go into all that. Instead, I'm going to assume these doctors were being very diligent and correctly identifying the condition, then properly medicating. Mary did tell close friends that Eric was dealing with very serious psychological issues, and by the age of 5 until he was at least 10, he was taking several different prescription medications for ADHD. ADHD medication is considered safe and effective. The risks are small, and the benefits are well documented. I would really like to know what Eric's symptoms were, because ADHD is not a serious psychological issue. So was he being properly medicated, and was he actually diagnosed with the right disorder? Eric's friends actually said he was a normal kid, and as he grew up, he was very popular with the ladies. He was always very well put together, impeccably dressed, with his perfect blonde hair always styled just right. He had big, bright blue eyes and a white smile. Plus his family was well off, so that made him very desirable. He drove nice cars and enjoyed the expensive luxury lifestyle, but it was all on his family's dime. They didn't seem to mind though, because he was accustomed to that lifestyle. It is all he's known for his entire life. Eric had a lot of girlfriends. He loved taking them out to 5-star restaurants, enjoying a nice bottle of wine, spoiling them with expensive gifts. People who knew Eric said he was popular, confident, and you could tell he was rich. He always had nice things. Girls were always trying to get with him, so most of his relationships didn't last very long. He just had so many girls to choose from. One of Eric's exes told friends that she had literally hit the jackpot when she landed Eric. According to her, he was super hot, taking her on lavish weekend getaway vacations, buying her whatever she wanted. But what about committing crimes by the age of 20? Is that normal? Well, it became a normal occurrence for Eric. In 1995, he was caught breaking into homes in Oakland County, Michigan, which is just north of Detroit. And don't ask me what he was doing there. He pled guilty to a series of home invasions. Since he was a first-time offender, the court allowed him to serve his 5-month sentence in a boot camp program, followed by probation upon release, instead of going to jail. Can money buy freedom? I don't know, maybe. Maybe it can just buy a more comfortable sentence. Eric finished the boot camp, and then he broke the terms of his probation less than a year later, in 1997. This time, the judge wasn't so lenient. He sentenced him to 18 months in prison. Do you think it's true? Once a criminal, always a criminal? For Eric, he was definitely on a streak. He gets out of prison and decides to attempt to steal from a department store. The clerk chases after him and he commits aggravated battery. Eric, what are you thinking? I'm sure his parents could have afforded to buy whatever it was that he wanted, instead of him trying to steal it. However, stranger things have happened. It kind of reminds me of the Winona Ryder case. Do you remember her? She's the actress from Stranger Things. She plays Joyce Byers' mom to Will and Jonathan. Well, in 2001, she was convicted of shoplifting thousands of dollars worth of merchandise from a Beverly Hills Saks Fifth Avenue. I don't know why she stole things, but she pleaded guilty. In 1999, this time, she was sentenced to 180 days in jail and 30 months probation. He's still living at home. His parents decide, okay, let's convert the basement into somewhat of a man cave. His room is much bigger than a standard bedroom and had anything and everything he could have possibly needed and wanted. But in order to keep living there, his parents pleaded with him to stop getting in trouble. They would even have interventions whenever Eric was acting out or lying, which seemed like he did often. Of course, Eric was annoyed by these interventions, so he would spend a lot of time traveling or living with friends. In 2002, he was living in Phoenix, Arizona. I think he might have been going to college there because he did graduate with a 4-year degree. However, I didn't see what school he went to. While he was in Arizona, he started dating a girl named Allison Beck, and things moved very quickly. They end up getting engaged and decide to move from Phoenix back to Illinois and live with Eric's family. Allison enjoys Eric's company and likes that he buys her nice things. And as time went on, the gifts got more and more extravagant. He was spending more and more money on Allison. She did notice that he always paid with credit cards though, and I'm thinking, is this his money or his parents'? And you might be wondering the same thing. Did Eric even have a job? Well, we know in 2004, Allison decided to move to California, so they end up breaking up, but they're still seeing each other pretty often and keeping in touch regularly. At this point, Terry was sick of footing all of Eric's bills. He wanted him to take responsibility and get a job. Meanwhile, Kate pulls her mom aside and tells her that she and Jimmy believe Eric had one of their missing garage door openers because money and valuables were gone from their home right after Eric had visited. As much as Kate didn't want to accuse her own brother, it's the only theory that made sense to them at the time. Kate wanted her parents to do something, and that's hard because Eric's an adult. If this happened with a stranger, they'd probably call the police. But in this case, it's family. This can cause tension between Kate, her husband, her parents, and Eric. So it's a really tough spot for her to be in. Kate and Eric weren't as close as they were before because Kate took issue with the fact that Mary babied him. She thought Eric should be a man and step up, do something with his life, and stop bleeding his parents dry. She tried having conversations with him. He would just deny it, or he would blame others, or he would just insist, okay, I'm going to change, but it didn't seem to happen. Mary would make excuses for Eric time and time again. She was always concerned with protecting the family's image. She would tell Kate, do not say anything to Terry, I will take care of it, and talk to Eric. At this point, Mary was working. She was in a position at MetLife Insurance, so she had some money of her own. If Eric needed something, he didn't need to take it from anyone. She would figure it out. Mary liked to keep appearances up. She cared what neighbors thought and what friends and coworkers were going to think. She didn't want it to look like they didn't have things under control. She explained to Kate, Eric is already going through a rough time. He's trying his best, and I don't want to put more stress on him. I'm not saying Mary's doing this, and I'm not saying Eric is, but have you ever thought to yourself that people are just thinking, well, you make enough money, who cares? You can just buy another one of whatever it is you lost or that was taken. And I wonder, is that the definition of entitlement? Because I think people think that way. Because Katie wanted him to, Jimmy has a talk with Eric, and he denies taking the garage door opener or that he took anything from their home. Eric felt like they looked down on him. They were placing blame on him because of his actions from the past and his bad decisions from before. But in any case, Jimmy bans Eric from the S residence until further notice. In April of 2005, Eric is 28 years old. He finally lands a job as a loan originator for a company called Home Loan Center, and it seems like he's enjoying it. He's making his own money now, and in just a few weeks, he's flying out to California a lot more to see Allison. He's driving a black Chevy Trailblazer, he's got these new expensive rims, and he's bragging to his sister Jennifer that he's going to write his own mortgage for a condo soon. Allison's 29, she's living out in California. She's glad Eric is doing well, and maybe that's why she wanted to see him more. He's finally getting his life together. When he visited her in May, he talked about how well things were going, and that he was actually considering moving there. He told her he was doing very well at his job and that things were really turning around. So they started to plan to see each other more. At the same time though, Eric was dating another girl. She lived locally. Her name was Christine Undesser, and I'm assuming Allison did not know this. Seems like his propensity to lie hadn't changed. Or maybe it was just that it wasn't that serious with Christine, and until things happened with Allison again, he figured he'd just have someone to keep him company in Illinois. I don't know. It was the third week of September 2005. Allison and Eric had met up in Chicago for a friend's wedding that weekend. Then Allison flew back to California, and Eric made plans to meet her there the following weekend for a Neil Diamond concert that was going to be at the Staples Center in LA for his world tour on Friday night, September 30th. Mary thought that was perfect because Ron and Andy planned to take a trip with her and Terry out west along the Mississippi River to a town called Galena. The two couples planned to stay for about 4 days, and they were leaving the morning of September 29th. This town looks gorgeous. There's a lot of historical sites, there's boutiques, golf courses, and we know that Terry likes playing golf. It looks like a really fun place for a getaway. Eric made his flight reservation for the 29th at 9:30 a.m. out of Chicago Midway Airport. He gave Allison all the details. He let her know he would need to leave his house around 6:30 in the morning to get to the airport in time, so she was probably going to need to call him to make sure he was awake. Wednesday, September 28th, the night before Eric was set to leave for LA, he meets up with Christine at 7 p.m. They're at a pub and eatery called the Fox and Hound. They were having drinks, hanging out, and they talked for a couple of hours. They had planned to stay longer, but when pressed about what Eric was going to be doing that weekend, he admitted he was flying out to LA to hang out with his ex-fiancée, Allison. Oh look, he can be honest. Christine became visibly upset. She told Eric to take her home. Eric arrived at Christine's apartment at 1 a.m. They sat in the car and talked for about 15 or 20 minutes, and then he went and headed home. He arrived and settled in somewhere around 11 p.m. and he said goodnight to his dad, Terry, who was sitting in his home office, and then Eric made his way down to the basement level. At this point, Allison gets a call from Eric. It's around 11:30, and they're just discussing plans for the next day, but then she couldn't hear him very well. There was static on the line. He said his phone was dying and he got frustrated, so he tells Allison, "Can you just call me back real quick?" So she calls back, and at this point, Terry answered the phone at the same time. And this was back when we used to use landlines, in case this sounds confusing. But they were both on the line. Eric said, "Hey Dad, I've got it." So Terry ends up hanging up. I remember those days because parents would listen in on the other line. They would pretend they hung up, and then they would try to spy on you and your boyfriend's conversation or your friend's conversation. But I could always tell they were on their line because I could hear them breathing. Eric and Allison talked for about 15 minutes, again just going over the plans for the next day. And then Eric said goodnight. He hung up the phone, put a movie into his DVD player, and fell asleep around maybe 1:30 in the morning. When Eric woke up, he knew he had a very busy day. He wasted no time. He left the house real fast and went to a convenience store to pick up a pack of cigarettes. He came back, he took a shower, he threw the rest of his things in a bag, and he left for the airport. While he's driving, he remembered he was actually supposed to drop something off to Jimmy and Kate before the trip, and it had slipped his mind. So he decides, okay, I know they might get mad at me, but screw it. I'll just have to do it when I come back. This is when he realizes he forgot his wallet, including his driver's license. That was going to be a problem. He's already halfway to the airport at this time, so he is pissed. There was no other choice. He had to turn around, miss his flight, and try to book another one once he got back home. And he knew what time he could make the next flight. As you can probably imagine, this was not ideal. No one likes when this stuff happens. He gets home, he makes sure he has everything this time, he calls up Southwest, and he gets a new flight for 11:15 a.m. It's arriving at LAX at 1:30 p.m., so he decides at this point maybe he should just go ahead and book his return flight. He got a flight leaving LA on Sunday, October 2nd at 11:15 a.m., arriving back in Chicago at 5:10 p.m., just in time for him to settle back in, get a good night's sleep before work the next day, on Monday. He quickly calls Allison to tell her the bad news and the good news, and then once again heads out. This time he calls his cousin Bob while he's on his way. They have a close relationship, and he explains what happened. He asked Bob if he thinks he's going to make it on time and if he knew the best roads to take and the best place for him to park once he got to the airport. And of course, he just explained to Bob that he was frustrated. He missed his other flight. He feels really tired. He didn't go to bed till late that night. He just wants to get to the airport, get on the plane, take a little nap. So Bob tries to give him the best advice and tells him good luck, and they hang up. Yay. This time he actually makes it to the airport on time. He calls Bob back, he lets him know I'm hopping on my flight, and just about 4 hours later, I'm going to be in LA. Chicago is 2 hours ahead, so he would go back in time. He arrives at 1:30 p.m. Allison is excited to see him. She asked him how the flight was. He said it was fine, he just slept the whole time. Eric and Allison start planning their weekend together. However, something is about to throw them a curveball. That Friday morning, Ron calls Mary and Terry before their trip to check in and go over their plans, but there's no answer. That wasn't that unusual, so Ron leaves a message for Terry to call him back. When Terry didn't call back after 10 minutes, Ron started to get a little worried that the couple may have forgotten about their plans. So he tries once more. Still no answer. An hour and a half or so had gone by, and Terry still hadn't returned Ron's calls. Ron tells his wife, Andy, to try Mary's cell phone. No answer. He figured they might be out doing some last-minute shopping or packing, so he let it go and waited. Meanwhile, something else was happening that had people close to the family concerned. Jimmy's brother, Kiyoshi, saw him and Kate the evening before, leaving the office around 5 p.m. But neither one of them were in the office that morning, and they weren't answering his calls. He was really concerned that the couple had not shown up to work, especially Jimmy. So, Kiyoshi tries calling Mary's work to find out if she knew what was going on. A co-worker named Catherine Von Holten answers and says Mary had not shown up. She didn't realize that Mary had planned to take off work that day for her trip, so she starts to worry. Considering Kiyoshi's worry, she calls Mary several times on her phone. No answer. Catherine then tries Terry's workplace, Ashland Distribution in Willow Springs. A co-worker confirms that Terry hasn't shown up, nor had he called to say he was going to be late. Again, though, they forgot he was supposed to take a trip that day. They become concerned, and the co-worker calls Bob, who also works at Ashland Distribution. Bob explains Terry had planned to take a trip, and then the co-worker remembers. But he says Terry planned to leave after this meeting, so Bob started to think something may have happened. It wasn't typical for Terry to miss an appointment, especially a business meeting. Bob tells Terry's co-worker he will head over to their house to check on them. Catherine had already called Mary's daughter, Jennifer. She thought maybe Jennifer knew something. Jennifer explains she tried calling her dad on his cell phone at 7:15 that morning about something she needed to repair in her home, and he never answered. Jennifer goes on to say she tried the office and Mary's cell phone, and there was no answer and no callback. She tries calling Kate. The same thing, no answer. Jennifer gets worried, so she provides Catherine with the Hansons' garage door entry code. She tells her, "Let yourself in and check on my parents." Then Jennifer calls Bob. Bob says he's already ready to head over there. Catherine gets into the Hansons' home, accompanied by another co-worker, Belinda Robinson. They go through the garage and into the house, and they start looking around. They didn't see anything that was out of place. From their perspective, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The only thing that could be questionable was a very strong fire burning in the fireplace while the house was unoccupied. Having a fire burning in an empty house is quite odd unless you just totally forgot. I wondered if a strong fire would indicate that it had been started recently or if it had been burning for a while. I looked up the weather for that area in September, and typically it's around 77 degrees Fahrenheit during the day and 53 degrees Fahrenheit at night, which is very similar to the weather here in LA. So would you even need a fire going? Personally, I do like to sit by the fire and read at night, but I get cold very easily. Catherine finds a note from Eric on the kitchen counter. It reads, "Mom, Dad, see you Sunday, have fun." Next to the note was some cash and a PS that said, "This is this month's rent," since it was the end of September. Catherine finds a pen and also leaves a note right next to that one for Mary. Bob arrives, also looks through the entire house, and sees nothing wrong except for what he described as a raging fire in the fireplace. He found it odd. He didn't recall the Hansons ever having a fire going when no one was home. Bob also said he wasn't used to seeing the house as clean as it was, but he knew that the family members were planning to be out of town, and they may have purposely tidied up so that when they came home, there would be an organized home for them upon their return. Bob starts to think something may have happened after Eric left that morning. He begins to get concerned but doesn't want to upset Jennifer quite yet. He does call her from the Hansons' landline to let her know her parents were not home. That's when she tells him she remembered Kate had called her a couple of times the night before, around 10 p.m. and again at 10:06 p.m. She missed the first call, but Jennifer's daughter picked it up and talked to her. It must not have been that in-depth since Kate called back just 6 minutes later. It could have been just a, "Hey, have your mom call me back," or "Let her know I called." But Jennifer was getting ready for bed, so she opted not to answer the second call and decided to return Kate's call in the morning. Belinda, Bob, and Catherine decide to leave together in Bob's car to check if the Hansons are at Kate and Jimmy's house. Bob knows he spoke to Eric that morning, and had Eric noticed anything, he definitely would have said something. He would still be on his flight at this time, so Bob planned to call him later. Bob doesn't know that Kiyoshi already made it to the house. When he gets to Jimmy's house, Kiyoshi rang the doorbell, but nobody answered. There are plenty of windows in the house, so Kiyoshi starts to look through them. That's when he made a gruesome and frightening discovery. He saw a woman's body on the floor surrounded by blood. He was terrified. It's your worst nightmare. Your mind is racing. What does it mean? Did Jimmy do something? Is Jimmy okay? What do you do? Kiyoshi immediately calls his daughter because he cannot believe what he just saw, and he can't bring himself to look again. He tells her, "Please hurry up. I need help." And he needs someone to confirm that what he saw was real. His heart is racing. He begins pacing outside, then sits down on the sidewalk with his head in his hands as he waits for his daughter to arrive. Kiyoshi's worst nightmare was true. There was a body of a woman on the floor. It was too far away from the window to make out who it was, but they assumed it was Kate. They quickly called the police. No one had a key to the house, so when the fire department arrived, they had to kick the front door in. Kiyoshi runs inside. The first thing he saw was a person's lifeless, bloody, bludgeoned body, stiff and frozen in an upright position on a couch in the family room. There was an open laptop on the floor. Kiyoshi didn't recognize this person. He couldn't even make out the clothing because they were so soaked in blood. He couldn't tell what color they were. What was terrifying was that the person really had no face. There's no other way to describe it. Their face was bashed in. It was completely unrecognizable. Kiyoshi scans the room in a matter of seconds. He runs past that person up the stairs to look for Jimmy. He had to find him. What had happened here? Yesterday was a normal day. The couple had left work together. They were happy, and now they're dead. No one was upstairs. His first thought was that a group of people had broken in. Jimmy fought two of them off, beat them, left them dead, tried to escape with Kate. But they were both captured and kidnapped and probably going to be held for ransom. That person with the laptop was probably forcing Jimmy to give up his bank account information at gunpoint. The police asked Kiyoshi to exit the house because the forensic team, police, and detectives needed it to be cleared for entry. Back at Ron and Andy's house, Ron is still perplexed as to why Terry hasn't returned their calls. It's getting later into the afternoon. He's half watching, half listening to the TV when a breaking news special interrupts his show. It's the local news reporting on a young couple found killed in their Aurora home. He got chills. He continued watching but had this feeling that it was going to be Jimmy and Kate. The neighborhood looked so familiar. Then they panned across the house, and it was evident in that moment that it was the Hansons' house. The brick, the corner lot, everything. It had bright yellow crime scene tape up around it, people standing outside being questioned, others crying. Ron and Andy were horrified. They figured this is why the Hansons hadn't returned their calls, because of this horrific family tragedy. They didn't know what to do. It wasn't the right time to go calling them to question them about what happened. Besides, they weren't even sure anyone knew, because it was breaking news. This had just happened. By the time Bob, Belinda, and Catherine arrived at the house, the authorities were already on the scene, and Terry's silver Impala was parked in the driveway. They knew this wasn't good. One of the first detectives handling this case was Michael Nils from the Aurora Police Department. He did a walkthrough, and even though he's worked on many crime scenes, and I know a lot of detectives say this was truly one of the most devastating scenes he had ever experienced in his entire career. It was so brutal and so excessive, and right away he thought, this cannot be a simple robbery. The injuries were too severe. It had to be someone evil, someone that wanted to send a message. First, he came across what was later positively identified during the autopsy as Jimmy Sal. Nils could hardly look. The body had no face, it was demolished. All the teeth had been shattered. There was nearly nothing left, which is why Jimmy's brother probably ran right past him, still holding out hope that Jimmy was alive and that this person, still sitting up with a laptop beside them on the floor, was an intruder. It seemed as though the attacker came up from behind Jimmy and ambushed him without a moment for him to react. Nils didn't see any weapons. Then he walked toward the master bedroom and found Kate on the floor in the doorway. She was covered in wounds, too many for him to count. Different shapes, some circles, other squares, various sizes and depths. There were big welts all over her head, clearly indicating she had been hit repeatedly over and over again in the face until she was unrecognizable. He could tell she had fought to stay alive. There were defensive wounds all over her hands and arms, and he could tell just by looking at the unnatural position of her arms that both of them were broken. They were snapped in half by her attacker as she was trying to protect herself. There was blood all over the ceilings, the walls, windows, drapes, floors, everywhere. Kate had been running. She was trying to find a way out, to live for everything that she hoped and dreamed for. She most likely witnessed the man she loved being bludgeoned, or at the least, already deceased, and appearing the way he did. It's unimaginable to think about hearing someone you love screaming in pain, to think about running for your life only to be trapped in your own bedroom. The bedroom where you kissed your husband goodnight the night before, where you laughed together and dreamed together. It absolutely sickens me. He continued into the kitchen, and there was a big plastic painter's tarp on the floor. It didn't take long to notice it was only covering half of a woman's body. He could not believe he was stumbling upon a third victim. It was Mary Hanson. She was deceased, lying face up in a blood-soaked nightgown with a single hole in her face on the right side of her upper lip. He heard Aurora Police Lieutenant Rusty Sullivan yell that he found another body. It was Terry Hanson. His body was found in the garage, lying between a Lexus and a Mercedes. He was also dressed in his pajamas. Terry's head was wrapped in some kind of washcloth and then covered with a plastic bag. He was on top of the same plastic painter's tarp that Mary was on. The method used in Mary and Terry's case was completely different from Kate and Jimmy's, which led detectives to believe there could be more than one perpetrator. Perhaps Kate and Jimmy were the targets, and Mary and Terry got in the way somehow. Terry had been shot one time in the left side of the back of his head. Both Terry and Mary were barefoot. Their feet were clean, as if they hadn't walked there on their own. Besides, why would anyone willingly come over in their pajamas without wearing shoes? Detectives suspect the Hansons were deceased prior to arriving at the house, that they were killed somewhere else, then placed there to somehow stage the scene. But why, and where were they killed, and when? There were so many questions that needed to be answered, but first, Nils knew he had to do something he despised. It might be the hardest part of his job, worse than walking a crime scene. He had to break the news to everyone that they had found an entire family annihilated. Bob was the first person to be notified, and he knew he would have to be the one to call and break the news to Eric and Jennifer. That was probably the hardest thing he ever had to do up until this point in his life. Niels notified Jimmy's family next. They were on the scene, waiting outside, and the news just spread. Within no time, there were news trucks surrounding the house. Terry and Mary's best friends, Ron and Andy, were glued to the TV. The news came back on and reported they found Terry and Mary both deceased. It didn't seem real. Today, they were all supposed to be leaving on a retreat. They were supposed to be walking down cobblestone roads, enjoying dinners by candlelight, wine tastings, and watching the sunset. They had a whole weekend planned, and this was so far off track from what they imagined they'd be doing. It felt like they were having an out-of-body experience. It was just too surreal. This can't happen to people like the Hansons. You never think this will happen to people that you know and love, people so close to you. I just thought back to the note that Eric wrote. Mom, Dad, see you Sunday. Have fun in Galena. It's important to pay attention because the evidence in this case is all over the place. There's so much evidence, yet it leaves so many questions unanswered. Or does it? That's up to you to decide. There are 2 separate police departments working on this case. The one in Aurora, with Detective Nils handling the house, and the Nail Police Department, who would be investigating the Hansons' residence. The lead detective in Nail is Michael Saylor, so we have Michael Nils in Aurora and Michael Saylor in Nail. Saylor was attempting to get a warrant to search the Hansons' residence. Different jurisdiction rules procedure, and the crime scene was discovered at Sal's residence. So while the search warrant is pending, Nail police begin to canvass the area around Hanson's residence, while the Aurora police spread out and begin to canvass the area in Sal's neighborhood, starting with family, friends, and neighbors. Deborah Cheskin, whose backyard backs up to Hanson's backyard, told Detective Saylor that her dog was being anxious around 2 a.m., so she let him out into the backyard. As she was standing there, she looked up at Hanson's house and noticed all the lights in the entire house were on, even the light in Eric's bedroom in the basement. She said the whole house was bright, and in all the years she's lived there, she has never once seen lights on like that at that hour. When she woke up for the day around 6 a.m., she let her dog out. This time, the only light that was on was the one in the kitchen, which was completely normal for that time of day. Another neighbor, Michael Bissell, said he was catching a flight early that morning at 4:30 a.m. He lived on the street and had to pass Hanson's as he drove away. There was an ordinance in this community which prohibited vehicles from being parked on the street between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. That morning, though, there wasn't just one car parked outside Hanson's house on the street. There were 3. One was a dark-colored SUV, the other was a light-colored sedan, and the third was an SUV of some kind, but he couldn't make out the color. Mary had a black Saturn SUV, and Terry drove a silver Impala. The police had to figure out who the third vehicle belonged to. They got their first clue when they questioned Nancy Herrera, Hanson's next-door neighbor. She was leaving her house between 5 o'clock and 5:30 that morning. She said she was very familiar with all the vehicles that belonged to the Hanson family. She said she saw Eric's black Chevy parked on the street, and that was unusual. He always parked in the driveway. Police knew from speaking to Bob that Eric was up early to catch his flight, and we know he had driven to the convenience store early that morning to grab cigarettes. You're allowed to park on the street after 5 a.m., so there wasn't an issue there. But as for why the other vehicles were parked on the street earlier, there wasn't an answer yet. Mary's SUV was currently parked in Hanson's garage next to a motorcycle belonging to Eric. However, Terry's car was not there. Detectives on the scene at the Sal's confirmed that Terry's Impala was parked in Sal's driveway. When Aurora police questioned Sal's neighbors, a woman named Nisha Kra, who lived right across the street, said that she left around 6 o'clock in the morning to drop her son off at school. She saw the silver car in the driveway when she left. However, when she left, it was parked on the far left-hand side of the driveway, facing the garage door. When she returned about 15 to 30 minutes later, the car was parked on the opposite side, so now it's on the far right, pulled into the driveway facing the garage door. That's weird, and it stayed there. Bob confirmed this was Terry's car. We'll go back to this timeline, but let's jump all the way to 10 p.m. that night. Saylor entered the Hansons' home after obtaining the search warrant. He was instructed to find out if there was evidence of a crime scene at the Hansons, because Aurora police were adamant that Mary and Terry had not been killed at the S's home. They had been murdered somewhere else and then transported to the Sal's crime scene. There was no apparent forced entry at the Hansons. Upon entering, the first thing that S noticed was the smell. It was a combination of scented candles and charred wood. He found 12 candles and a centerpiece candle holder on the table in the kitchen, and another candle on the kitchen island. All of the candles were melted down, and there was wax that had dripped onto the surfaces. Underneath the coffee pot was filled with water and unused coffee grounds, as though it was ready to be turned on and brewed. He didn't notice anything suspicious. He turned his attention to the fireplace. There were still embers burning inside. A big chunk of charred wood was in there, some type of fabric that had like a tight weave, a ball of melted plastic, and what looked like pieces of paper with numbers on them. Maybe the fact that these unusual items were in the fireplace was why it was burning so strongly when Catherine, Belinda, and Bob witnessed it. After Saylor completed an entire walkthrough, he did not notice anything that looked disturbed. It was late, so he had to leave, and he planned to come back the next day. This search took a few days. They had to be super thorough, as I'm sure you can imagine. A team of investigators, including police officers, detectives, DNA analysts, they were all there as well. Then, a clue. Crime scene investigators removed the Hansons' bedding. They discovered 2 holes in a wooden headboard. This confused me a little bit, so listen carefully, and we'll try to go through this. One was more toward the top of the headboard, and the other one was toward the bottom. The one on the top went all the way through to the other side. The one on the bottom looked like a hole that you would try to drill, but the drill wouldn't go all the way through. There were tiny wood shavings that were around, and the 2 holes were not the same size. The top one was bigger, and it looked like it had been enlarged with a drill. When checking behind the headboard, they noticed the hole on top had a blown-out look to it. In the back, they followed the direction of the hole, and sure enough, there was another hole through the wall behind the headboard. The hole was also drilled. There were drywall shavings on the floor. But get this, all of the holes were filled, the one on the wall with spackling compound, and the headboard holes with wood filler. Were these bullet holes? That was the question. They did an extensive search and uncovered a bullet stuck in the attic in a beam behind the bedroom wall. This was really starting to paint a picture of what transpired. It seemed as though the Hansons were shot in their own home, in their master bedroom, probably while they were sleeping. That's why they were in their pajamas with bare feet, unlike Jimmy and Kate, who were dressed in their regular daytime attire. But what still remained a mystery was why the bodies would be moved from the Hanson to the S's. Why go through all that trouble? What was the timeline? Surely the Hansons were not having a sleepover at the S's, were they? Were they there when Jimmy and Kate were attacked? It truly amazes me how thorough crime scene investigators are. I mean, I know it's their job, but these investigators end up checking in the vacuum cleaner. Inside the receptacle bag, they find pieces of wood that match the headboard. The killer took time to vacuum, to fill holes in the wall, to make beds. The CSI goes back into the master bedroom, and they examine the mattress, and it's totally clean. There's no blood, no nothing. However, upon further investigation, they check a guest bedroom down the hall, and they find a bloody mattress. They had been switched out. The clean one that was in the guest room is now in the Hansons' bedroom, and vice versa, and all of the beds had been remade. They also confirmed a linen closet shelves had empty spaces, which indicated that sheets were missing. They noted the indentations on the carpet that showed that the master bed had been moved. All of this takes time. It's definitely a staged scene, and so was the S's. Since the Hansons were clearly moved to the other residence, which is why they were wrapped up, so that blood and DNA wouldn't transfer anywhere and they would be easier to move. Other items of significance that were found: on October 3rd, in the garage, they found wood spackling compound, sanding blocks, paint, and in the basement, there was an empty bottle of carpet cleaner, another one that was open, paper towels, cleaning products, a carpet shampooer, as well as a cordless drill and drill bits, and they were in a container, and one of them was missing. There were also what looked like blood stains in Mary's SUV, on the carpet in the back, and her keys were found inside the home. Towels in the bathroom looked exactly the same as the one that was on Terry's head, and similar plastic bags were found underneath the sink in the kitchen, and that matched the one on Terry's head. Jennifer was in her parents' home that afternoon with detectives. She was gathering clothing for her parents' funeral. She also provided detectives with a bunch of papers that she had found when she was going through Mary's top drawer in her dresser. One was a credit report in Mary's name, with circles around certain transactions, and then question marks beside them. They wondered if the Hansons were experiencing financial issues. New detectives needed to gather information from anyone close to the Hansons. Even though it's a tough time, they have to. Jennifer and Eric lost their parents and their sister. Bob lost his family members. The SS lost Jimmy and Kate. There's just so much loss, yet it has to be done. They have to be questioned, and sadly, they have to relive that pain. In the moment, it can also make you feel really nervous and uncomfortable, and as if you're a suspect. By October 5th, they still hadn't arrested anyone. All they had was circumstantial evidence, no witnesses, and no weapons. Lieutenant Sullivan from the Aurora Police Department issued a statement regarding the murders. He held a press conference, confirming 4 individuals had been identified as 34-year-old Jimmy Saw, his 31-year-old wife Kate Saw, Kate's parents 57-year-old Terry Hanson, and his 55-year-old wife Mary. They pleaded with the public to provide any information they may have about this crime. The autopsy report was also released, and it's bad. Both Kate and Jimmy's fatal injuries were caused by blunt force trauma to the head, very excessive force from something like a bat, a golf club, a pipe. Jimmy's lower jaw was found across the room. Kate's ring finger was bent backwards and broken, and her wedding ring that was valued at over $24,000 was gone. Her ring finger, though, had no indentation from a ring and no cuts and no bruises. Kate sustained 40 wounds, 22 of which were cuts and scrapes and bumps on her head, and 18 more on her body and her limbs. Jimmy had at least 12 separate injuries to his head, but it only took one skull-crushing blow to end both of their lives. Several of the wounds found on the bodies had specific indentations in the shapes of circles and squares, and this made me pause to think, what kind of instrument could cause that? Oddly, when they said pipe, the very first thing I thought of was a metal pipe with a 4-point iron T and 1 or more galvanized pipe plugs. I just remember picking one up as a teen when my dad was doing some plumbing, and I actually morbidly pictured the damage that it would do. It would be like a hammer, with many different ways of hitting someone. Some marks it would leave would be squares, like the top of the galvanized area, and then others would be circles or holes, where you have the holes of the T that are left open. Or you could just use the straight part of the pipe while gripping it at the T, and this would provide a really secure, strong grip as you swing it. You can easily buy these items at a local hardware store, and you would never look suspicious if you cleaned it off and you threw it somewhere. It would also be pretty inconspicuous. We already know the Hansons' cause of death. There was nothing additional in the autopsy report besides finding gunshot residue stippling on Terry's head. This indicated a second gunshot was fired near Terry's head but did not hit him. This was most likely the shot to Mary's face. Let's jump back to when the bodies were first discovered, the afternoon of the 29th. Since Bob was on the scene at the S's, Niels interviewed him right away. He asked Bob when he last spoke to any of the deceased who had access to the homes, and if he knew anyone that would do this. Bob said the only person he knew that could have access to both homes would possibly be Eric, and that he had spoken to him that morning. Of course, the people closest to the victims are always looked at first, so this piqued Niels' interest. He wanted to dig deeper, especially because Eric was conveniently out of town. He didn't want to tip Eric off. He didn't even know his parents were dead yet. So he reached out to Allison, and instead Eric was still en route to LA at the time. Allison said the plan to go to the concert was her idea, and they made those plans weeks in advance. Then she told them everything we already know about the night before, but there were some inconsistencies. She said she spoke to Eric at 6:45 last evening. He said he was on his way to the gym, and we know he was actually meeting with Christine. Then at 9:21, he called to say he was leaving the gym and stopping by a hardware store. That's interesting. Were you buying, I don't know, paint, painter's tarps filler for holes in the wall? Why would he need to go there that night? I don't know. But we do know he was actually still with Christine at that time until about 10:15, and detectives confirmed that timeline with her. At 11:30 p.m., he called Allison to tell her he was on his way home from having a drink with a friend named Jared. Another lie. He also told Allison to call him at home on the landline. She thought that was a little bit odd because she wasn't used to calling that late at night. But she said, "My phone's dying. I have a really bad connection in the basement." That's when him and Terry answered the phone at the same time. Allison also mentioned that if anything was happening in the house, Eric would have definitely been able to hear it. She lived there in the basement. He's a light sleeper, and you can hear the garage door opening. You can hear the plumbing through the walls. You could even hear people just walking around upstairs. Look, he could have been lying, just to cover up the fact that he was with another woman. But Allison said she thought it was odd that he asked her where the nearest Nike store was in LA. She said, "You don't need sneakers. It's hot out. We'll be wearing sandals." He also never told her that he forgot his wallet at home and missed his flight. He said he missed it because he was stuck in traffic. Nels asked her what his relationship was like with his family, and Allison tells him Eric felt like his family gave him a hard time, that his sisters were already established in life and he wasn't, so he felt kind of jealous, especially of Jimmy and Kate's life. She went from being a waitress to being able to afford designer purses, driving nice cars, not having to worry, and technically she hadn't even worked for it. Jimmy did. Yet Kate would look down upon Eric. She would make it a point to talk down about him to his mother and tell his mom not to help him, yet Jimmy is providing for Kate with everything. Allison said Eric was trying. He landed a new job a few months ago, and he was doing better than ever. They tell Allison if she can think of anything else, let them know, but please do not tell Eric anything yet. They know it's hard, but this is a murder investigation, a quadruple murder investigation. Niels reaches out to Eric's boss, Mike Stoker. He said Eric was the company's lowest producer, and the job was 100% commission-based. Between the time Eric started in April 2005 to September, he only made $839, definitely not enough to live a lavish lifestyle. He admitted to Mike that his parents took care of everything because they were well off. Nils asked if there was anything unusual about Eric, and he said not really until recently. His attendance had been fine in the beginning, but then all of a sudden at the end of August, he started to be more and more absent, and by September, he was hardly coming to work. Then he tells Nils, Eric doesn't even work here anymore. Apparently, on September 19th, Eric left a voice message for Mike saying that his brother-in-law, Jennifer's husband, died in a very bad car accident. He said that unfortunately he needed to fly to Minnesota for the funeral, and he never talked to his boss again. Nils asked if Eric had left anything behind at work, and if so, please bring it to the police station. Bob had already told Jennifer the horrible news, and she was completely distraught. Yet Nils had to do his job and speak with her. She confirmed Eric had been spending a lot of money leading up to September and always had issues with overspending. She actually questioned him a few times about where he was getting all the money, and she was concerned that their mother was being taken advantage of. She said that at the beginning of last month in August, Kate and Mary were at the Hansons talking about taking a trip together to Hawaii. When Mary was checking how many miles she had on her United Airlines credit card, she was confused as to why there were so many accounts under her name. Kate immediately suspected Eric had opened up these extra accounts and was using the credit cards in his mom's name. They kinda put two and two together, and they figured out he was probably racking up the frequent flyer miles, and that's how he was getting to California. They confronted Eric that day, and he admitted to it. He promised he would pay Mary back. Of course, Mary was upset, but she was even more upset that Kate really came down hard on Eric. It was not a pleasant conversation. It was loud and angry, judgmental, just putting him down left and right. Mary just thought Kate was a bit harsh, and she was worried that Eric would do something. He would go into a downward spiral and harm himself. Mary allowed Eric to come up with a payment plan, but Kate would not let it go. She just kept digging, and she was able to uncover that Eric had charged around $80,000 to Mary's credit cards. Again, she and Mary confronted Eric, and this time it was worse. He already said he was going to pay her back, but Kate didn't believe him, and she didn't think he ever could. So she threatened to tell Terry. On August 14th, Kate called Jennifer and explained all of this. She said Mary promised not to tell Terry, but Kate said, "You know what? I've had enough, Mom. You keep enabling him. Enough is enough. I'm telling Dad." This is when Eric freaks out and he yelled, "If you tell Dad, I will kill you." I understand people can say things they don't mean in the heat of the moment, but Kate was so upset, she got so scared that she called Jennifer the next day, and she said, "Listen, I can't even leave my house. I have to miss work today." Jennifer said Katie was still determined to make Eric pay, and she went so far as to reach out to Allison. She called her up and she simply said, "Hey Allison, if I were you, I would check your credit report." No one knew if there were any other details given to Allison, but that happened. Jennifer said her husband Corey was never in a car accident. He's not dead. Just yesterday, September 28th, Eric had just called to speak to Corey, asking him if he wanted to go to a Vikings game next week in Minnesota, and if they were going to go, could Eric spend the night at their place. Eric never stayed over when he visited Minnesota. He stayed with friends. So Nils just straight up asked Jennifer if she thought Eric could have done this, and she says yes. She believes that if Terry would have found out about what Eric did, he would have called the police. Eric had already been in trouble with the law. He had already been in prison. If he got another charge against him, he'd probably be going away for a while. She then says, yes, Eric did this, even though none of this actually means Eric is a murderer. Nils thinks something isn't right. He calls Allison back and asks if she had ever seen Eric become violent. She says no, but he did yell at her recently. That same month, he kept asking her on various occasions whether she had been talking to Kate. Allison lied and she said no. Eric said if he ever found out that she was speaking with Kate, she was going to get it. Those were his exact words. Allison asked what Eric meant by that, and he said, "Wait and see." She asked if that was a threat, and he said, "That's a fact." After Nils learns that Eric threatened not one, but two people close to him in the weeks leading up to the murders, he now becomes the prime suspect. We don't know if Allison told Eric anything about the situation before anyone reached out to him. After this, she is his girlfriend, or was his fiancée, still having a relationship with him. She's known him for years. She's probably the closest person to him. My thoughts are she probably told him. He lands at 1:45 p.m. Pacific time. He calls Allison, who's still at work, and she allegedly tells him, "Just go to my apartment and relax until I get home." It's around 4 p.m. back in Illinois. I have a hard time believing she didn't tell him about his parents. She lived with his parents. She was close to that family. What do you think? Around 5:30 or 6, Bob calls Eric to let him know what happened to his family. Bob Al has suspicions after speaking with Nils. Tensions are running high. Everybody wants answers. When Eric picks up, Bob allegedly says, "I'm hearing there's 4 deceased bodies at Kate's home." Bob tells Nils that Eric's response was, "How did people know to go looking over there?" What I'm thinking, did he really say that? This is the same person that they are saying took all that time and effort to patch up holes, switch out mattresses, vacuum. Would he seriously make a remark like that? I'm just asking your thoughts. Bob hands the phone to Nels. He makes a note that Eric is not acting like someone who just found out their family died. He wasn't asking questions. He wasn't asking questions. He told the police everything we already know. That's how we got that information. That was his story. The night out with Christine, the phone calls to Allison, going home, waking up, that whole story. Then Nils said Jennifer thinks you did this. Wow. Nils specifically asks Eric if he had anything to do with this, and he says no, and that he didn't have any idea who would. He tells Eric that he knows he had an argument with Kate over using his parents' identities to get credit cards. Eric admits he had taken money like 4 years ago, but he already paid that back, and that Kate was always putting her nose in everyone's business. Eric said he never threatened her, and that she wasn't even at the house the day that Mary confronted him about this. She just kept calling over and over and over again. While they were talking, she was trying to get in the middle of an issue that him and his mom were working out. He also asked Nils, "Why didn't you just call me first right away, instead of asking Jennifer and Bob things about me?" He tells him, "I was the one that told Bob to give you the phone. I wanted to talk to you." He responds to Eric by telling him that detectives are going to fly out to LA to speak with him face to face. The first flight that they can get doesn't arrive until midnight. Eric agrees to meet them at LAX, but then Nils calls back a little while later and he says never mind, they cannot get there until 10:30 a.m. the next morning. Eric said that's fine. He wants them to know that just because he's in the airport right now waiting on them doesn't mean that he's trying to run. Okay, after this call, around 11:49 p.m. Central, 9:49 Pacific, Eric cancels his plans to meet up with Allison. He tells her, "I'm getting a hotel and I'm going to take a nap." However, that's not true. Eric was actually trying to book a flight home. He tried to book one from the Southwest desk, but when the ticket agent was looking up notes under his name in the computer, an alert came up and it said, "If this passenger tries to check in, contact the LAPD and that he's dangerous." Unfortunately, instead of actually contacting the LAPD, she tells Eric that he's been flagged in the computer. So he leaves that counter and he goes to the United Airlines counter instead. Here he was able to book a flight back to Chicago, leaving at 11:05 p.m., and he was able to get on that flight. So was he running or was he just trying to go back home? Now remember, Detective Saylor was just entering the Hansons' home at 1 p.m., so no one knew any of the additional evidence that was found. But these detectives do not sleep. So overnight, they have combined all of the statements from the neighbors, family members, and they're trying to piece it all together so that they can build a case. It didn't prove that Eric did this, but they had to question him the next morning, September 30th. Nils gets a call from the FBI saying that Eric's parking stub had been swiped at Chicago Midway Airport and that he left the lot at 6:30 in the morning. Nils calls Eric's phone. Eric lies and says he's still in LA waiting on detectives. However, they're tracking his phone, and he's actually driving westbound on Interstate 88 in Illinois towards Interstate 39, which was how you would get to Minnesota where Jennifer lived. Now they were scared he was on the way to murder her, the only surviving heir and the one person who's accusing him of killing his whole family and revealing his secrets. They tell Jennifer to get her family and leave just in case. A Madison, Wisconsin, trooper named Craig Morehouse got a dispatch call to be on the lookout for a black Chevy Trailblazer with Illinois plates. This was around I-90 West, and they gave him a description of Eric. Sure enough, he sees Eric's vehicle. He calls for assistance. 3 additional officers join in, and when Eric tried to exit, they pulled him over. Eric was apprehended. They handcuffed him, threw him in the back of a police car, and they told him he was under arrest for an outstanding warrant. He told them he had no idea there was a warrant for his arrest. What was it for? They explained it was for the intimidation and connection with the threats he made to Kate. Eric said he knew that the police wanted to talk to him, that his family had just died, but he had no idea that they were actively trying to find him to arrest him. He didn't know that he couldn't freely go anywhere that he wanted to. He was taken to a Wisconsin police department where he would wait to be interviewed by Nils. Meanwhile, his vehicle was being towed back to Aurora so it could undergo a thorough investigation. Police officer Ronaldo Riviera found shopping bags full of brand new clothes that had just been purchased that day with one of Mary's credit cards. There was a wallet on the passenger seat with about $750 in it. In the center console, he found Eric's ID and driver's license and 9 credit cards. Some were in his name, others were in Mary's name. And guess what? One of them was in Allison's name. So let me get this straight. After he finds out that his mother's deceased and the police are aware that he's committed credit card fraud, he's out using Mary's credit card again. Officer Riviera also collected a Ziploc bag that he retrieved from the floor that was underneath the passenger seat, and when he looked inside, he could see 2 pairs of green vinyl gloves, and it looked like they had dried blood on them. Then he makes a pretty big discovery. Kate's wedding ring and one of Jimmy's gold Rolex watches with a bunch of diamonds in it was found in the glove compartment. A GPS device was recovered from the Chevy as well, and forensic analysis showed it had been turned off between 7:30 p.m. the night of the murders and 9:30 a.m. the day after. Guilt seemed apparent. Not to mention, more and more evidence was being turned over from the Hansons, as well as more information from Eric's friends and family. Eric's boss handed over a checkbook belonging to Mary that he found when he cleaned out Eric's office desk. Detective Saylor found financial documents in Mary's name consisting of credit reports and a bunch of handwritten notes regarding account balances and credit card statements, and they were stuck between the mattress and the box spring in Eric's bedroom. After Nils presented Allison with additional evidence against Eric, she finally admitted that shortly before September 28, 2005, Eric had told her he calculated exactly how much money he would inherit if his parents died. She also said she remembered when she was living at the Hansons, Eric would go rifling through Terry's documents in his home office. When questioned about Eric's room, his habits, and whether he was tidy and used cleaning products, Allison and Bob both said it would be highly unusual if Eric's room was clean. Eric even called himself a slob, and Bob never saw that room. In order, Allison echoed this by saying that Eric was very messy. As all this additional evidence is pouring in, Nils is interviewing Eric. He questioned him for 3 days, just trying to break him down and get him to talk. They kept asking him, if it wasn't you, who was it? All the while, they needed forensics to provide more concrete evidence to link Eric to the crimes and build a case. Remember that Eric was apprehended on the 30th. That was the first full day the forensic team was in the Hansons' home. The same 3 days that Eric's being questioned, evidence is being uncovered and reported to Nils. Eric continues to deny any involvement. Forensic analysis of Jimmy's laptop showed that the very last keystroke happened at 10:43 p.m. on September 28th. Let me ask you this. Could Eric have left Christine at 10:15? Made it to the Saul's residence, bludgeoned both of them so severely, leaving no evidence behind, no weapons, no fingerprints, then left their house, drove home, was able to be on the phone with Allison at home at 11:30 when Terry picked up, waited until his parents both fell asleep, shot them in the room, carried them, wrapped them up, carried them, put them in the SUV, driven back over to the Saul's residence, got them both into the house without alerting any neighbors or the 24-hour patrolman, then made sure there's nothing at that whole scene again, drove back home, somehow got Terry's and Paula over to the C's without a car to drive back, but also be back at the Hansons patching up walls, cleaning carpets, switching mattresses, burning evidence, getting rid of weapons, organizing the whole house, and make it to the airport by 11 a.m. The next morning? You tell me this was their working theory. Nils confronts Eric about the Rolex and Kate's wedding ring. He said, yeah, he was in possession of both of them. He was supposed to drop them off before he went on the plane to LA, but he was running late. He left them in his car in a secured area in the glove compartment for safekeeping until he returned. He explained that Kate had taken off her ring a few days ago when she was at the Hansons painting flower pots and gardening with Mary. The Rolex was over at the Hansons because Kate wanted Terry to try it on, so they knew how many links they'd need to add or take off of a band for the one that Jimmy was planning on getting Terry for Christmas. Kate had instructed Eric to bring them by their house as soon as possible, so he had put them in a bag, and he meant to take them with him so that he could bring them to Kate's, but he was running late. No matter how hard the detectives pressed him, he never confessed, and he finally asked for an attorney. Detective Nils actually broke down and cried when he wasn't able to get the confession. It's just that everything had built up. It was so emotional. But police said, "You know what? We don't even need a confession to prosecute him." In an October 8th jailhouse interview, he said he was innocent. I have a couple of very short excerpts from that call. "I think I'm just tired of everything being so one-sided. Everyone, I believe, wants to make me out to look like, I'm just a horrible person. I could do something like this and I'm not. It's very difficult. How would you feel if, people are saying you killed your family?" He doesn't sound like he's lying there. That's what's scary. You could also still love your parents, even though you killed them. Of course, the investigation didn't stop. As he waits to be extradited back to Illinois from Wisconsin on the intimidation charges, authorities are continuing to build their case. More and more evidence was mounting. Women that Eric dated were now coming forward, and it seemed like he had girlfriends everywhere. Some even told the police that Eric said he was a professional golfer, and most of them believed he was very wealthy. Plain and simple, the police think that greed was the motive here. And the more they dug into the Hansons' financial records, the more Eric's guilt seemed apparent. Plain and simple, the police think that greed was the motive here. The more they dug into the Hansons' financial records, the more Eric's elaborate scheme became apparent. That credit report that Jennifer had pulled out from Mary's dresser, dated August 13th, 2005, was a day before Kate called Jennifer and told her that Eric had threatened to kill her if she told Terry. Forensic accountants were able to piece together a timeline of events dating back to the beginning of 2004. That was when Eric started using credit cards from accounts he opened in his parents' names. He had cleverly opened a P.O. box and had all the statements coming there instead of the Hansons' home. Back then, people weren't logging on to their iPhone or their Android app to check their banking accounts, so they were not seeing what they were spending. He would open up a number of accounts, then he would max one card out, then he'd open up another card, and then he would pay off the one he maxed out. He would just keep doing this over and over again. At some point, though, it just wasn't sustainable. So he began concocting a new plan. He started forging checks from his mother's checkbook and depositing them into his bank account. Finally, he began his final scheme. The very last transaction occurred on the exact day that the Hansons were killed. It began with obtaining a $48,000 loan in his father's name. How do you even do that? He was living off that for a while, but of course, he spent it. On the day of the murders, he once again used Terry's identity to secure a $113,000 loan with a check payable to Mary Hanson. He was home waiting for it, and it was delivered right to the Hanson front door by FedEx. He then forged Mary's signature, and he took that check and put it into his checking account. Finally, a couple of months later, Friday, December 4th, 2005, Two-Pig State Attorney Joseph Burett announced 44 charges stemming from the murders, including 4 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of armed robbery, 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping, 2 counts of identity theft. Some of the other charges were forgery, credit card fraud, mail fraud, and 2 counts of home invasion. Burett said if convicted, Eric would be eligible for the death penalty. Eric pleads not guilty on all counts. His trial was set for February 2008. While awaiting trial, Eric begins writing letters to Bob and Jennifer. In one to Jennifer, he says, "Jenny, I know a lot more than you think. Dad talked to me about a lot more than anyone else thought. It's obvious that you're trying to pull the wool over my eyes, but it won't work. You can't avoid the paper trail. P.S. No matter how much you try to screw me, I still love you." Interesting letter. I don't know what he meant by the paper trail. How would she be pulling the wool over his eyes? Confuse me.I and another letter to Jennifer, who is now the executive of the parents' estate. Eric detailed his knowledge of all of his parents' assets, nearly to the penny. This was something Jennifer hadn't even known until she became the executive. Eric somehow also knew the value of all of his sister Kate's personal property, including the value of each and every one of her designer bags. In an 11-page letter to Bob from jail, Eric stated that he had told Kate to stay out of his life or she would regret it. He also wrote that Kate did ask him if he was threatening her, and he said, "No, I'm promising." During the month-long trial, the prosecution called a number of expert witnesses to present evidence that leaned toward Eric being connected to the murder. I wish I could go into this entire trial. I I did go to law school, but I love just knowing every little detail of how all the evidence was presented that the jury had when they determined the verdict. I'm not going to be able to tell you everything, but I'm going to tell you the most important things. So here they are. Jimmy's DNA was on the watch. The stains on the green gloves were matched to Terry and Mary's DNA. The Ziploc bag was determined to come from a box that was at the Hansons' home. The bullet found in the wall matched the ones in Terry and Mary. Terry's DNA was found in the back of the SUV where the stains were found. However, there was also a lack of evidence. There was a fingerprint on the gloves that didn't match Eric's. However, testing wasn't done to compare it to Terry and Mary's. Detective Niels testified to what the driving times would be under the conditions that were similar to the night in question. On September 28, 2005, from Kristen's apartment to the S's home, it was about 10 to 15 minutes. From the S's home to the Hansons, it was approximately 5 minutes. That was back in 2005. Maybe it's a lot busier now. The defense argued Kate wasn't wearing her ring that week. They showed a CCTV video from a store taken shortly before the murders in which the ring was absent from her finger. The prosecution argued the video was way too fuzzy. You wouldn't be able to tell if she was wearing a ring or not. They thought what was more significant was that Eric's DNA wasn't even on the ring or the watch. And this showed that he hadn't even picked up the jewelry from his house to put it in a bag to put in his car to return it to them when he was on his way to the airport, as he claimed, unless he was wearing gloves. The thing is, touch DNA can be very unreliable. Some of us were not shutters, especially if he had just taken a shower, which he said he had before leaving for his trip. Kate's ring did contain a reddish stain, but no DNA was able to be lifted. The state says this is because he wiped it. Eric's defense attorney argued there were 2 unidentified fingerprints in the Saturn, which would mean strangers unconnected to the Hanson family could have accessed the vehicle. The prosecution came right back and said no, the fingerprints were unable to be lifted from the surface. That's why they were unidentifiable. They just were not able to be used for comparison. Then the defense comes back and says, well, either way, that evidence is inconclusive. So that meant there was no evidence to prove that the fingerprints could not have been left there by one or both of the Hansons. The defense further emphasized there were no bloody shoe marks, clothing, or possible murder weapons ever found. The state brings up the fact that there was a raging fire in the Hansons' fireplace that was burning with no one home. It was highly unusual that someone would start a fire and then just leave. The fire was burning so intensely that when Bob was there, a burning log tumbled out of the fireplace, and it was so intense that embers were still warm at 10:30 p.m. When Detective Saylor came in, and let's not forget there was a chunk of charred wood, a melted ball of plastic, skek papers with numbers written on them, and a piece of fabric. Was the chunk of wood a baseball bat that was used to bludgeon Jimmy and Kate? Was the fabric from, Eric's bloody clothes? And was the big blob bloody gloves, or even bloody shoes? One argument that stood out to me was that because Eric had shaved off all of his body hair right before he left for Los Angeles, he did this to preclude forensic testing. Eric said no, that's a normal habit, and I thought it made sense because he was going to see Allison. Hence, he wanted to be clean-shaven, anticipating sex. The state asked if he was innocent. Why did he run? He says he didn't. He argued that he wanted to avoid this confrontation at the airport, face-to-face with the police. He wasn't under arrest. He was free to go anywhere he wanted at any time, but he could have simply avoided that by returning to Chicago and invoking his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. Instead, he decides it would be better to lie to the police. The law says that evidence of flight by itself is not sufficient evidence to establish guilt, but it is a piece of evidence that you can take into account to infer the consciousness of guilt. The last thing Eric argued was that the state's evidence of his motive was speculative. According to Eric, he had worked things out with Terry. Terry agreed to get a loan to cover the credit card debt that Eric fraudulently incurred so that they could save their credit from declining. Terry was busy and he kept putting it off while Mary's credit was dropping. Eric then took it upon himself to fraudulently obtain the loan using Terry's identity. Terry was going to do it anyway. He just figured, I'm going to get the ball rolling faster. But the jury was supposed to believe that despite this breach of trust, Terry supposedly agreed to yet another loan, which Eric had also obtained fraudulently when Terry once again procrastinated. And this was secured the day of the murders. And that's not suspicious? It was argued that anyone that's rational could find Eric's testimony was completely self-serving, and it was also inconsistent to what his sisters and what Eric himself said that his dad would flip out if he found out. We're coming to the end of this video, and this was really important for me to look at, so I want to share it with you. I want to be able to break this down and think like a juror for the jury to have found Eric not guilty. This is what they would have had to believe. Are you ready? That the GPS unit in the defendant's car deactivated itself, or some unknown person deactivated fortuitously on the evening of the murders. That an unknown person made peaceable entry into the S's home and bludgeoned Kate and Jimmy. That an unknown person made peaceable entry into the Hansons' home while Eric slept and shot Mary and Terry in the master bedroom. B. Turned on all the lights in the house, including in Eric's bedroom. C. Retrieved plastic tarps from the garage and wrapped Mary and Terry's body in them. D. Moved the Hansons' vehicles and transported the bodies to the Sal's residence. E. Cleaned the Hansons' home, including Eric's bedroom. F. Moved furniture, switched mattresses, and made the beds. And G. Drilled holes in the parents' headboard and wall and then filled them. Or that an unknown person re-entered the Hansons' home on September 29th after Eric left, and A. Burned items in the fireplace. B. Burned scented candles to disguise the odors of gunpowder, blood, and cleaning agents. That an unknown person put bloody gloves containing Mary and Terry's DNA into a plastic bag from the Hansons' kitchen and then placed that bag in Eric's car. That someone besides Eric was a common link between the Hansons and the S's household. And 7. That an unknown person staged the Sal's residence to make it appear that the murders had all occurred there in order to deflect any suspicion from Eric. What do you think? If you were on the jury, what would you be thinking? This case is so complicated and complex to me, and very interesting, because it was still a fact that there were no shoe prints, fingerprints, hair, saliva, blood, or even trace evidence like a fiber from anything of Eric's at the Sal's crime scene. In closing arguments, the defense argued Eric could not have killed 4 people and cleared the homes of evidence by himself or in time to leave the next morning. I'm still stuck on the car situation. Did he walk back to his parents' house after leaving Terry's car there to throw off the search? Because I'm thinking the 3 cars were parked outside of the Hansons' residence. The one neighbor saw all 3 cars. Why would they be pulled out of the garage and put on the street? Maybe it was because, I love thinking these through, maybe it was because initially Mary's SUV was parked beside the motorcycle in the garage, and then Terry and Eric were parked outside, blocking the garage door from Mary's SUV being able to come out. Therefore, Eric takes both the cars, parks those on the streets, maybe pulls out the SUV and turns it around and faces it into the garage with the back facing a better position for him to get the bodies into the vehicle. Then he drives the SUV from the Hanson to the Sal residence. I don't know how he unloaded everything there, but it is a 3-car garage now that I'm thinking of it, because there's a 2-car garage, and they said there was a Lexus and a Mercedes. So I don't know about that 3rd garage area, if he was able to use remember the missing garage door opener? If he was able to use that and then pull into that garage. I didn't think of that. But let's just say he didn't, and he was just outside. They say that the reason that Terry's body was between the Mercedes and the Lexus which kinda means he didn't go through the other side. So let's just grasp that was because he couldn't carry him any further, like he was tired by this point. So he pulls the SUV backwards up to the garage door, opens the garage door with the garage door opener, and pulls his parents out of the vehicle into the house with no one seeing him. After he does that, he gets back in his mom's SUV, he leaves the scene, pulls his mom's car back into the Hansons' garage where it was before, and then drives Terry's and Paula's. I don't know why, because that would be obvious. Like, why didn't you just leave it at home? Doesn't make any sense to me if you wanted to throw them off. I don't know. But he drove the Impala back to the S's, and then he would have to have walked back. How long would that have taken him? Because I love doing the math. Not good at math, but I like doing the math. Okay, I just paused and I looked it up. It would take him 1 hour and 30 minutes to walk from the S's residence back to the Hansons. So if you include all of the driving time from before, and I'm just gonna say it's 40, because when I did the math it said 12 minutes. So if you're taking all of this into account, that's like 2 hours of just travel time. 2 hours. And we don't know when his parents fell asleep. Oh, I'm not saying he didn't do it. I'm just kind of perplexed on how he was able to pull it off. This was his first time killing people. This was his first crime scene. Maybe some people are just way better at that than others. That's creepy, but that's 2 hours of just getting from place to place. Not to mention, like I said, we don't know when his parents fell asleep. He saw his dad at 11:30. Did they fall asleep at midnight? Did they fall asleep at 1:30? When did they fall asleep? By 2 o'clock all the lights were on in the house. Let's not forget. So, I would assume it had to have happened before 2, and since he mentioned the time 1:30, that always means to me that there's some kind of significance to that. So I'm going to assume it happened at 1:30, and that's why all the lights were on by 2, when the neighbor took out her dog. So it's 2 o'clock. But also, can we just stop and think about the fact that he was at Christine's at 10:15, and he somehow got over to the S's residence and was able to kill Jimmy by 10:43? Didn't they say it takes 20 minutes for him to get there? That left like 3 minutes for him to kill him. I'm telling you, the numbers are off. The numbers are definitely off. That's a lot to do in such a little amount of time. So I do not think the bodies were in the home when he was cleaning. I'm pretty sure he would have gone and gotten rid of them first, and then come back and done all the cleaning. So let's say he was home by 3 o'clock to do everything. That only gives him like 3.5 hours, unless he never got on the road like he said he did. So really, he left around like 9:30 in the morning. That gives him about 5 or 6 hours. I think that would be enough time. What do you think? What are your conclusions? Eric chose to testify, and he did so for 5 whole hours. He admitted to lying to his family, using the credit cards and the money that wasn't his, but he said he already admitted that he had no motive to kill them. He was already planning to pay them back, and he had already started paying them back. He just had really bad impulse control, and he kept falling back into stealing. But he did not kill anyone. The prosecution argued the motive was simple: greed, jealousy, and trying to keep up his fake lifestyle. Once it began to unravel, the only way out was to get rid of everyone, which got him closer to inheriting more money that wasn't his. A jury of 8 men and 4 women only deliberated for 3 hours Wednesday, February 20th, before finding Eric guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder, as well as a bunch of other charges. But I won't go into all of those. Eric just sat there with no expression on his face as Judge Robert Anderson announced the verdict on Thursday, February 21 stant. The same jury began the process of going through the penalty phase. This would determine whether Eric would spend the rest of his life in prison or be sentenced to death. Jennifer said Eric should not be put to death, but she did cry tears of relief and hug the prosecutors and family and friends outside the courthouse after the guilty verdict. During the penalty phase, defense attorneys called Dr. Marva Dawkins. She's a clinical psychologist who testified that Eric was suffering from narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial and dependency features. She also tried to emphasize the fact that he was diagnosed with ADHD at 18 months old and he had been on several different medications when he was growing up. I know we kind of touched on that. I don't know what your thoughts and opinions are. I would love to hear them below. She said that all of these conditions started when he was just a child, and they've continued throughout his adulthood. She spent a lot of time interviewing him in jail, and she reviewed hundreds of pieces of evidence. I don't really understand her conclusion fully, but she concluded Eric had an unpredictable relationship with his parents. And although he seems macho, he's actually very sensitive, weak, and vulnerable. I wasn't sure if she was arguing that these things had to do with him committing the crime or that he didn't commit the crime. I don't know. State Attorney Berlin argued that the impact of something like ADHD on these murders was very low. He even said Bill Gates and several US presidents have had ADHD and that they didn't kill anyone. Another statement he made, which I'm not sure I 100% agree with, but you can tell me what you think. He said that even if he had a personality disorder, it didn't make him commit the murders. What do you think about that? On February 28, 2008, the jury sentenced Eric to death. They only deliberated for 90 minutes. However, in 2011, the Illinois General Assembly abolished the death penalty. Eric's death sentence was commuted by Democratic Governor Pat Quinn. He said it was the most difficult decision he ever had to make as a governor. He said that if you decide to abolish the death penalty, you have to do it for everyone. He tried to offer some kind words to victims' families, so he said that the family of Illinois was with them, but he understood that they'll never heal from what happened to them. Prosecutors and some victims' families urged Quinn not to abolish the death penalty, but despite this, he went forward and 15 sentences were commuted, including Eric's. It's true that Eric may not have been able to afford much outside of jail, but in the end, he was able to buy himself time here on Earth. Imagine you just graduated from college, and you are pursuing your passions and dreams into grad school. Your fiancé just proposed, and you're picking out your wedding dress, preparing for your beautiful spring wedding. But during the Christmas holiday, tragedy strikes, and all of those dreams are suspended in time, becoming mere memories for all the people left behind. Today, I'm going to be talking about a very heartbreaking case, and I want to get serious fast. A girl that's dreamed of meeting her Prince Charming one day, having a beautiful wedding and kids, and the charming home and successful career. It's a big dream, a dream that was coming true for one Tennessee woman, but a dream that ended in a nightmare. I'm introducing you Jonia Hope Berry. It's spelled J-O-8-N-I-A. Jonia Hope Berry was born in Bristol, Tennessee on August 26, 1983. Bristol is located in Sullivan County. The population is about 30,000 people. Wikipedia is where it's at sometimes. And I got this information about this area that I thought was so interesting. The city is located near the state line between Tennessee and Virginia, and it's connected to its twin city of Bristol, Virginia. State Street serves as the border between these two cities. One thing that came up every time I was searching for Bristol, Tennessee, was the fact that it is known as the birthplace of country music. Every article I read said, believe it or not, even though you thought the birthplace of country was in Nashville, it's not. The first commercial recording was made in Bristol, and one of the first musical groups in Bristol to record country music was the Carter Family in 1927. So we are going back. June Carter, the future wife of legendary musician Johnny Cash, was one of them. NASCAR's a big thing there. But whether you like it or not, Bristol has one of NASCAR's loudest tracks. It's called the Bristol Motor Speedway. It's a very short track, it's less than a mile long, but it's famous because it has this extreme slope and the stadium is Roman-inspired, so it gives the appearance of a coliseum, and that's why they call it the last great coliseum. Jonia had two biological brothers, Tim and Kelly Burke, from her mother's previous marriage. But when she was 7 years old, her mother, Joan, remarried to a man named Michael Berry. Joan ended up giving Jonia Michael's last name, Berry, and she used it from that day forward. As a young girl, Jonia went to Holston View Elementary School and Vance Middle School. Jonia was a cheerleader for Bristol, Tennessee High School, from which she was a proud graduate. After graduating high school in 2001, Johnny enrolled at Eastern Tennessee State University, which was about a half-hour away from Bristol, in Johnson City. At Eastern Tennessee State University, or ETSU, she studied psychology and criminology. There was no shortage of activities for Johnny to do while she attended ETSU. There are these beautiful historic gardens on top of Roan Mountain on the Appalachian Trail, and they're only 30 minutes from the college. There was a lake nearby where you could go water skiing and boating. And then, just 1 hour east, is Mount Rogers National Recreation Center. And 1 hour west is the Great Smoky Mountains. Johnson City hosts a variety of festivals throughout the year, such as the Blue Plum Festival and the Rhythms and Roots Reunion. But one of her favorite things to do was dedicate her time to children. Johnny worked as a student assistant for 3.5 years at the Child Study Center, an early childhood learning program operated by ETSU. While Johnny enjoyed her time at college, her parents' favorite part was when their daughter came home to visit. They had since moved to Atlanta, Georgia, and every time Johnny arrived home, she would throw open the door and yell, "I'm home." Joan Berry was so happy every single time she heard her daughter's voice announcing that she was back for the weekend. As far as Joan was concerned, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Someone else thought something about Johnny was beautiful. Fellow university student Jason White. The two met in 2001 while taking classes in similar subject matter, and they were inseparable. They were more than just dating. They were completely smitten with one another. Jason planned on going to law school, and he and Johnny dated throughout their entire time attending ETSU. By the time they were set to graduate, Johnny decided to follow in Jason's footsteps and go into a legal career. They both planned on attending Thomas Cooley Law School in Michigan. Johnny was brilliant. She was graduating with 2 degrees from ETSU in the summer of 2004, after only 3.5 years of school. She expected to walk the stage as magna cum laude and receive her diploma in the winter on December 18, 2004. The previous winter, Jason had proposed for the first time. Yes, he proposed more than once. They were the type of couple that made other people cringe because they were that romantic. It wasn't uncommon for Jonah to joke with Jason that some time had passed, and he should propose again because it had been a couple of months. The last time Jason got down on one knee was in August. The two of them went to the Mendota River, and on the way there, they had to cross a swinging bridge. To Jonah's surprise, Jason got down on one knee yet again, ring in hand, her engagement ring that she had purposely left behind so she wouldn't lose it. They were inseparable and had a lot to look forward to, but most of all, they just wanted to spend time together in grad school. Upon graduating from ETSU, Johnny became one of the youngest people to ever be accepted into Thomas Cooley Law School. Wow, that's something to really be proud of. The couple moved to Michigan that summer in anticipation of the fall semester. However, while in her first few months of classes, Johnny realized it was not the right choice. At one point she called her father to vent, and I know that exact same feeling. She told him that she could not see herself as a lawyer because they seemed like they spent their entire days reading documents. She wasn't wrong. I shared the same viewpoint. Since Johnny had always been passionate about children, she decided to pursue a career in something that she was genuinely passionate about. Because of her change of heart, Johnny moved back to Tennessee, Knoxville to be exact, where she intended to pursue a master's degree in child psychology. She had been accepted for graduate studies at the University of Tennessee and planned to enroll in the spring of 2005. This is also when she planned to get married, in April of that very same semester. She wanted a beautiful spring wedding and had already picked out her wedding dress. She already had it. She was ready to go. Joan and Mike Berry had no doubt that Johnny had made the right decision. They were happy that she was moving back home to Tennessee, and despite her age, only 21, Johnny was mature, she was level-headed, and her parents trusted her. I can imagine why someone like Jason would be attracted to Johnny. Not only was she gorgeous, gorgeous, she was also smart, generous, charismatic, and made friends easily. Every time I read something about Johnny, it was positive, how she was just so special. She was the type of person that people were automatically drawn to. But she was drawn to Jason White. Though they were long distance, they loved each other, and they knew the time apart would be worth the wait. Not a day went by that the couple didn't speak to each other on the phone. They would even fall asleep talking to one another because Jonna really liked that. Upon moving back to Tennessee in 2004, at 21 years old, she was living with another Jason, a close friend whom she attended ETSU with. He was one of her friend Stephanie Keene's boyfriends. His name was Jason Ammon. He was 23 years old, and he had offered up an extra bedroom in his apartment to her until she could get fully established back in Knoxville. Yes, she was rooming with a guy, but they were merely friends. Jonna even made sure that she was comfortable living with him before she fully committed to moving in. Her mom even came out to spend some time at the apartment and get to know Jason. The apartment they shared was in a complex called Brendan Park in Knoxville, Tennessee. I looked at it on a map like I always do, and it's a really happening area. Now, I'm not sure it looked exactly the same way back in 2004, but this is not a small town. The mall is only about a 5-minute drive, and it's a built-up area. It has popular chains like Home Depot, FedEx, Costco, and Walmart, among other fun places like golf courses, movie theaters, and lots of places to eat. Jonna was already working 2 jobs. One, because as I mentioned, she was saving so she could move out on her own. She only planned to be at Jason's for a couple more months until she could get her own place, but also because the holidays were coming up and she wanted some extra spending money. She was primarily working at a teen center at Peninsula Hospital, but as 2004 came to a close, she had just recently started working part-time at Sales Jewelry Store in the mall. It's always a busy time during the holidays, and it's nice to have a little extra spending money for presents and for fun. The Westtown Mall is exactly what comes to mind when you think of a typical mall, a big food court and stores like Dillard's, Sears, and Belk. Jonna liked to socialize, and she liked to have fun with friends. She didn't have that many in the immediate area, but she did spend time with her co-workers. On Sunday, December 5th, 2004, it was one of those evenings when work was ending, and Jonna had wanted to hang out for a bit. It wasn't the best night to go out, though, because it was cold and rainy, so her co-workers decided they'd rather call it a night. But they did walk out to their cars together after their shift, saying goodbye and driving safely. Jonna ended work around 6, so she probably got to her car between 6 and 7 o'clock. She got into her Chrysler Sebring convertible and drove off to do some Christmas shopping. Her first stop was Walgreens. Jonna called her mom while she was there, and she told her she was going to pick up a few more Christmas gifts and then head home to wrap them. She was planning on having a quiet night in. By 10 o'clock that night, Jonna was doing just that, wrapping gifts for the children at ETSU. She was thoughtful and caring, spending her hard-earned money to make these kids smile. Her roommate, Jason Ammon, came through the door around the time she was wrapping the gifts. They sat and talked for a little bit, and then Jonna decided it was time to get ready for bed while talking to her fiancé, Jason White, like she routinely did. Their call ended around 11 p.m. Only a few hours later, during the early morning hours of December 6th, 2004, around 4 a.m., a man covered in blood ran into a convenience store and asked for a phone to call 911. Seeing this bloody person running into the store, the employee behind the counter quickly did as the man asked. He called 911 and told the dispatcher that a man had just come through the door shirtless, and it looked like he had a lot of blood on him, like he'd been in a fight. He then handed the phone to the man. The man was Jason Ammon, Jonna's roommate. He told the 911 operator that he and his roommate, Jonna Berry, were sleeping when someone broke into their apartment and attacked them, someone with a knife. He said he felt someone stab him right in the chest, and then they hit him in the face. The first thing he did was get up and run, but during the commotion he heard Jonna screaming from her bedroom. She was screaming loudly, but he said he didn't have time to help her. He had to get out of there. When he saw a chance to escape, he fled the apartment, leaving Jonna behind. Police and paramedics were dispatched around 4:30 a.m. to 4:04, Ardora Road and the gas station where Jason had made the call. The EMTs assessed Jason's injuries immediately. He had definitely been stabbed, but most of his wounds appeared to be superficial. He had one stab wound to the chest, one to the arm, and one more significant injury to his right hand on his ring finger. This finger wound could have been from either offensive or defensive actions. It wasn't clear whether he had been wielding the knife or blocking it. None of his injuries were life-threatening, but he was rushed to the University of Tennessee Medical Center for treatment. The Brendan Park Apartments, where Jason and Jonna lived, are located right off a road called 10 Mile Road. It's a fairly built-up area with a neighboring complex called The Element, though it's unclear if that was there in 2004. As you come down the driveway, you can see the first set of apartments on the right, in Building 404. The Brendan Park Apartments, where Jason and Jonna lived, are located right off a road called 10 Mile Road. It's a fairly built-up area with a neighboring complex called The Element, though it's unclear if that was there in 2004. As you come down the driveway, you can see the first set of apartments on the right, in Building 404. There's a small flight of stairs outside the building that leads up to a glass door, which opens into the complex. From there, another flight of stairs takes you up to the second floor, as well as to the first floor apartments. Jason and Jonna's apartment was located on the second floor to the right. The communal glass door at the front didn't have a lock, so anyone could come inside and access the apartment doors. When the responding officers arrived at the apartment, they discovered a crime scene unlike any they had ever encountered before. Before they could even make their way upstairs into Jonna's apartment, they found something horrific at the bottom of the stairs: Jonna's bloody body lying face down. She was still alive, but barely. Jonna was struggling to breathe and fighting for her life. It was clear she had suffered numerous injuries. The officers asked Jonna if the assailant was still inside the apartment, but she couldn't speak. Poor Jonna was too weak to respond. However, a couple of the officers thought they saw her faintly nodding yes. They proceeded cautiously, not knowing if the suspect was still inside the building. They drew their weapons and entered the dark apartment, using hand signals to communicate silently in case the attacker was still there. Upon entering Jonna's room, the officers noticed signs of a violent struggle. There were red stains, presumably blood, all over the room. One of the responding officers later said that the crime scene at Brendan Park Apartments was the most horrific thing she had ever seen. The amount of blood in the bedroom was traumatizing and unforgettable. Once they were able to turn on the lights, they realized the bedroom wasn't the only room that was bloody. There was almost a trail throughout the entire apartment: walls, floors, furniture. It all had droplets or smears of blood. While the apartment was being searched, EMTs were talking to Jonna and holding her hand until she was fully transported to the back of the ambulance. They didn't want her to be alone. They didn't want her to think she was alone. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, 200 miles away in Atlanta. John, his parents, Mike and Joan, were woken up early that morning on December 6th at 5 a.m. by a phone call on Joan's cell phone. When she answered, the person on the other end asked for her husband Michael, so she, half awake, handed the phone to him. It was someone calling from the University of Tennessee Trauma Center, and they were informing him that his daughter Jonna had been a victim of a crime, and they needed to get there as soon as possible to identify her, as she may not survive her injuries. Joan could hear this, and she was in total disbelief of what she was hearing. She fell to her knees, cried, and prayed because she didn't want to believe this was happening. It was also a 4-hour drive to get from where they were to the hospital that Jonna was in. Astonished by what she had just heard and not wanting to believe that it was true, Joan called her 2 sons, Tim and Kelly, because they were closer to Knoxville, and she told them, "Please get to the hospital as fast as you possibly can," because she needed to know if it was really their sister. Joan described that drive as the longest ride of her life. She prayed the entire time. She just kept repeating, "God, please don't let it be Jonah," and it rained the entire way there, as if the sky was opening up and crying with her. On that drive to Knoxville, John and his parents hoped that they had misheard the person who told them that their daughter may not survive. When Jana's brothers arrived at the hospital, they were told they had to wait, and it seemed like hours before they were finally told that they could look at a picture of a woman who had been stabbed. They were praying it wasn't her, but as soon as the doctor flashed the first photograph of a woman's face, they knew. They knew it was her, their little sister. Poor Jana. It was real. When John's parents arrived, they were still holding out hope, but as soon as they saw Joan's son Kelly run to their car, hysterically crying right outside the hospital in Knoxville, Mike and Joan knew. They knew they had heard right, and the news got worse. Jana was gone. She did not survive her injuries. The boys had to break the awful news to their mother. Kelly just uttered, "It's Jana, Mom," and it was the most horrific day of their lives. They weren't even able to comprehend the magnitude of their loss at this point, and while they were left to grieve, detectives were working on Jana's case. After the ambulance had rushed her to the hospital, investigators cordoned off her apartment, and they started to search for evidence. The first thing investigators noticed was that it didn't seem like there were any forcible entry points at the apartment. Either this person was let in, or they had a key, or one of the doors was left unlocked. The first person they wanted to speak to was Jana's roommate. After all, he was there, and they already had a few things that they thought were suspicious about his version of what happened that night. For one thing, why did he walk 14 minutes to a gas station to get help? I wanted to understand this for myself, so I pulled up a map to see the path that Jason potentially took. We cannot know for sure which stores were there at the time, but I do notice that this area is pretty residential in nature. They're living in an apartment complex, and there's another one right next door. There's a post office, but this is 4 o'clock in the morning. That's going to be closed. The library isn't going to be open. After going down 10 Mile Road, he would have had the choice to go either left or right, and he chose to go left because there really isn't anything to the right as far as businesses are concerned, especially businesses that would be open at this point. He probably knew that the gas station was open 24/7. That was most likely the closest place that he knew he could have gotten help. I don't see anything else that would have been open. There's a coffee shop, a Dollar General, and again, we don't even know if those places were there at the time. But I thought, couldn't he have stopped and tried to get a neighbor to let him use their phone, which, in my mind, would have been way more convenient, considering he lives in a pretty large apartment complex. If you look at the overhead view right here, there are a number of buildings, whether it's in their own apartment complex or the neighboring one, and even around that there's a neighborhood on 10 Mile Road. It seems like there would have been a lot of residents in that area. So I was confused, as I'm sure the police were too, about why he would travel that far to use a phone. They were also curious about the wound on his hand. Could there have been a struggle between him and Jana? Could he be the one responsible? That's their first question, but they have many more. Jason was released pretty quickly from the hospital, and he presented himself voluntarily to the Knoxville Sheriff's Department. He wanted to give an official statement. Jason and Jana's relationship was the subject of the investigators' interest. He told police that he met Jana in college and was letting her stay with him when she returned to Knoxville 6 weeks ago. He explained that he had a girlfriend named Stephanie Keene and that she and Jana were friends. Nevertheless, the investigators pressed him about whether they were more than friends, and Jason swore that he and Jana never had a romantic relationship and that he didn't even have any romantic feelings toward her. Still, the police continued to question Jason repeatedly about his story. Jason said he returned home from work around 10:30 p.m. and Jana was still awake, wrapping presents for Christmas right inside their door, in this area right here in the apartment. You can still see some unwrapped toys on the floor in this crime scene photo. Jana made her way to bed soon after Jason got home from work, and after he entered his bedroom, he fell asleep. Jason said he remained in that sound sleep until he was woken up by Jana screaming in the middle of the night. When Jason rolled over, he looked at the clock and noticed it was 4 a.m. At first, he thought that Jana was having a nightmare, but still, he went to find out what was going on. When he opened his bedroom door, he saw a silhouette of someone he didn't recognize, a stranger. Someone was in their apartment. It was a man, and he was coming out of Jana's room. The intruder noticed Jason, and without hesitation, Jason said the man ran toward him, grabbed him by the shoulders, and pushed him back into his bedroom and onto his bed. Then a struggle ensued. According to Jason's version of events, he said he could see that the man had a knife and had started to stab him, which caused all of his wounds. At some point, he was able to push the assailant off him. That's when he rushed past the assailant, out of his bedroom door, then proceeded out of the front door, down that first long flight of stairs, out of the glass door that everybody shared, down the other tiny staircase, and all the way toward the gas station to call for help. When the investigators asked him whether or not he saw Jana, he said he never did. He could only hear her screaming, and he knew he had to get out of the apartment to save his life. He had no idea, according to him, what was going on in her bedroom. We know what happened the rest of the time because when he got to that convenience store, the clerk called 911, and that's how authorities were able to get to the scene. However, investigators were piecing together Jana's final moments. They asked Jason, "Which door did you escape the apartment through?" He said that as he was running, he remembered unlocking the front door. So, they asked him, "How do you think the intruder got access to your apartment?" He said it was probably through the back door because Jason couldn't remember if he locked it after throwing out the garbage. However, Jana was meticulous about locking their doors, especially before she went to sleep at night. She would routinely walk around checking that all the doors were locked, but Jason couldn't say whether that door was locked that night, and he wasn't around to see her check the doors before heading to bed. When investigators searched the back door of the apartment, they found blood. This discovery led them to believe that the intruder had left the apartment through the back door. In comparison to Jana's fatal injuries, Jason's wounds were relatively superficial, and that concerned investigators. One of Jason's only more severe injuries was a deep incision on his ring finger, which they thought may have been caused by either grabbing the knife from the attacker or by accidentally cutting himself while stabbing Jana. Not only that, but they were even starting to think his wounds could have been self-inflicted. Investigators reviewed Jason's 911 call because they wanted to know, are there any inconsistencies between what he said on the phone and what he's telling them now? While Jason told the dispatcher that he heard Jana screaming when he ran out of the house, in his interview, Jason said he wasn't sure when he heard her screaming because remember, he said that's what woke him up. He was very hesitant when they asked him to take a polygraph, but he said he wanted to clear his name, so he agreed to take it. However, when the polygrapher told him he had failed, Jason just kept denying killing Jana. He stated that he actually feared for his own life because the murderer was still out there. He felt like they were accusing him of killing his friend, and he became even more upset. The polygrapher even had to tell him to calm down, but Jason kept getting louder, yelling at the man, "Why would I voluntarily take this test if I had something to hide?" He just kept saying he felt like they thought he did this, and the polygrapher said, "Well, it sure looks like you did," which riled Jason up more. The argument went back and forth, with Jason becoming very heated, and the polygrapher kept saying, "There is no reason for you to get mad." But for Jason, there was. He was being accused of murder, and it's not something to take lightly. Well, then a second polygrapher reviewed Jason's lie detector test results and determined that the first examiner had made some mistakes and that Jason had actually passed. Kind of sketchy, but then again, these things are not a science, and that's why they're not admissible in a court of law. Jason was also all they had at this point, so they took this opportunity to ask him to sit down with a sketch artist to draw his description of the suspect. Jason said the man had short brown or blonde hair and a square chin. He was younger, possibly in his 20s, stocky, and kind of had droopy eyes that were shaped like pecans. He was under 200 pounds, maybe around 180. So, authorities released the image to the news and waited for tips to come in. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene in Jason's bedroom, Investigators found a piece of cardboard on the floor with a partial shoe print on it, so they went ahead and preserved that as evidence. Now here's the part of the story that angered me and saddened me. Outside Jana's apartment door, there were signs that she had tried to get help from her neighbors, which is just heartbreaking to me, and it was heartbreaking for investigators to see, some of whom had children of their own. This poor girl used the last bit of her strength to knock on every single door. 5 doors. The door right next to hers was only a few feet away, if that, and it had distinctive bloody knuckle prints on it. Not one of her neighbors came to her rescue. She made her way down the stairs and continued to drag herself to each and every door, becoming too weak to move and then finally collapsing in the doorway. She might have survived if just one person that heard her knock on their door answered. Why didn't they? I understand it's 4 a.m. I understand this is a scary situation, but all it takes is one call. That's it. Just one call for one person to help this poor girl. This is not a new phenomenon. There's a famous case I studied in both law school and when I was getting my psychology degree, the Kitty Genovese case out of New York. It happened back in 1964 at 3:15 in the morning. I'll never forget this story. 28-year-old bartender Kitty Genovese was followed home by a man who forced her to have intercourse and stabbed her outside of her own apartment building where she lived. Despite her crying and screaming for help, nobody came. That investigation started research into the bystander effect, or the Genovese syndrome. And this is a real thing. People do stand by and do virtually nothing, and there are reasons for this. Usually, it's fear. But investigators in Jana's case are shocked that, in 2004, not one of her neighbors did anything. But could they have possibly slept through it? They didn't know yet. They could ascertain Jana's approximate movements due to the amount of blood, the smears, and the trail. She was able to make it out of her bedroom after multiple wounds, and we will get to the autopsy. She made it to the living room, where it looked like she collapsed or had to rest. They gathered this from the stain that was left behind. This was a big one in the living room. At some point, with the will to live, she was able to get up off of that floor and get out of her apartment door, and she knocked on the one next to her. No answer. And like I said, she somehow made her way all the way down those stairs to every other door, but she was just too weak. When Jana's mom became aware that her daughter had attempted to save her own life, and no one helped her, it was beyond her understanding. It was heartbreaking and devastating. It was also really disturbing to her, because authorities did let her know that, even though they can't guarantee it, there is a possibility that if someone would have called an ambulance sooner, Jana could have survived. They could have done surgeries to keep her alive. This was what was the most heartbreaking to me. Envisioning your child's last moments. That's something that I would replay over and over again in my head because I'm already doing that now. I can only imagine if this happened to someone that I love and care about the way a mother does, and someone she will never see again. Back at the crime scene, investigators finally located the weapon that was used in this crime, and to their surprise, it's actually a kitchen knife from Jana's own kitchen. So this started to lend itself to one of their first theories, which was that Jason, her roommate, was involved. The fact that this weapon came straight from their own kitchen led the investigators to believe that this was a crime of passion, especially because of the location of her wounds and how many of them there were. They thought it might have to do with Jason being rejected, and that was their working theory at this point. The weapon was found right outside Jana's door. It's right here in this photo, and you can see the knife is almost bent in half. This is how much force was used. It was bagged as evidence. Later, they found a fingerprint as well as hair and blood on this knife. Now, let's talk about what they found at the back door. There are stairs leading down from the back door of this apartment. They found blood in a trail from the back door down the staircase. It was in a less significant amount. This is why they asked Jason which door he used, because they thought that it was interesting that Jonah had sustained so many wounds, and Jason had none. They took swabs to test his blood, but now they're also thinking if Jason's telling the truth. Whoever this blood belongs to could be the person that did this. When these types of crimes occur and forces are used, we obviously know how slippery the weapon can become. A lot of times the assailant actually gets injured in the process. So that is why they were interested in the wound on Jason's hand. Because of where the trail was, they also determined that the person was right-handed. It coincided with the fact that he would have been holding the knife in that hand, and that's where the blood trail was, down the right side of the staircase handrail. So now their next step would be to attempt to either eliminate Jason by finding out if there was somebody else in that area treated for a significant hand wound on the right hand on the night of the crime, or sometime thereafter, or finding out if it was Jason's blood. They also needed to find out about the shoe print that they found on the cardboard box in Jason's room. These were their two biggest clues right now. Meanwhile, they also had to move on to another man in Jana's life, another person who could have had the passion to lead them to do something like this. It was the other Jason, Jason White, her fiancé. Jason had to be notified about losing his fiancée, just like everyone else had been. Jason was 600 miles away in Lansing, Michigan, when his future mother-in-law, Joan Berry, called him at 10 a.m. to give him the devastating news. Just 12 hours earlier, Jana had been alive, speaking with him on the phone. It would have been shocking to get a call like this. When Joan told Jason, he let out a frightening scream, and it was so loud that it was heard outside of his apartment door. A neighbor, Melissa, was so concerned that she went over to see what was wrong, and all she saw him do was sit there, hysterically crying. When he could finally speak, he told Melissa what was going on and that he couldn't do anything for himself. She had to help him pack his things to get him to the airport, to get him on that flight, because he needed to get by Jana's side as soon as possible. Jason was beside himself, but that didn't matter to police. As soon as he got into town, they asked him to come in for an interview. Investigators questioned Jason White for 4 hours to determine whether he had any involvement. They wanted to know all about their relationship. They asked him, "Are you a jealous guy?" Jana was very pretty. Did you get jealous if she was talking to other guys, living with another guy? But Jason swore that he and Jonah had a great relationship, and that they were in love, and he had nothing to do with her murder. They found through phone records that Jana talked to Jason until about 11:30 p.m. the night she was murdered. During his interview, Jason White told investigators that he and Jana spoke almost every night until she drifted off to sleep. They questioned whether Jason White would have been able to drive from Michigan to Tennessee, or fly, or take a train, carry out this crime at the time they believed it occurred, and then get back to Michigan. But when they looked into all this, there was no way he could have accomplished it. Because of this, Jason White, Jana's fiancé, was cleared of suspicion. No one had anything bad to say about either of them. Both Jana and Jason's friends all loved them and said they were great people who didn't have any enemies, and they had a loving relationship. Jana's family also loved having Jason White in their lives, and they were looking forward to him becoming their son-in-law. The entire Berry family eerily anticipated Jana's wedding, but now they were planning Jana's funeral. It was all too unreal. 3 days after her murder, Jana was laid to rest in Bristol, Tennessee, and it rained through the entire funeral. Sadly, Jana would never be alive to experience her wedding, but she was wearing both her wedding dress and her engagement ring. Jason wanted her to keep it, of course, and he put that ring on her finger for the last time as she was laid to rest. Unfortunately, it would not slide onto her ring finger due to how swollen it was, so he had to put it on her pinky. Jana's murder ripped a large hole in her parents' hearts. As far as Mike and Joan Berry were concerned, their daughter Jana had no enemies, and they had no idea why anyone would want to hurt her. Jana loved life so much. Her parents couldn't even imagine a world without her in it. Things would never be the same for the Berry family. During her funeral, everyone commented on her roommate Jason's behavior. There were many people there, especially her family, who were mad that he even showed up. They really believed he had something to do with her murder. The fact that he didn't try to help her or stay behind to see if she got out alive was an issue. It's something that many of Jonah's friends and family members could not understand. Why leave her? Some people said that he acted weird. He was too calm. But he had just been through a traumatic experience. Even though investigators had done as much as they could to rule Jason out of the picture, they did have a theory that made sense to them. They think that Jason had shown interest in Jonah and she rejected him, which caused him to stab her in a fit of rage. So, investigators returned to Jonah's apartment with Jason after the murder and asked him to walk through the crime scene. Jason recounted the horrific events of that morning in December, and investigators were actually pretty surprised by his lack of emotion. In their view, Jason might be emotionally avoiding describing the murder because he committed it. Or maybe he was just dealing with the trauma in his own way. He was just so matter-of-fact. Even Jason's girlfriend, Stephanie, started to question things. Even though he maintained his innocence, there was just this "what if" lingering in the back of her mind. That must be really hard. You want to trust the person you love. You don't want to believe they did anything like this, but at the same time, do you really know a person? A crime lab tested the blood from the apartment, and the blood drops by the back door. The DNA discovered at the crime scene matched Jonah and Jason, but also a third person, an unknown male. Finally, the DNA results confirmed Jason's story. Someone else was there. Someone else was injured. Someone else bled and fled. This DNA was found on a light switch, on the weapon, and outside the back door down that staircase I showed you that leads out of the back of the apartment. Jason's blood was not found in this location. It was found in the front, on the doorknob and the door lock, confirming his story and thus finally clearing him as a suspect. However, the allegations against him tarnished Jason's reputation. Not only was he traumatized and injured after hearing about his roommate's death, but he also had to live with survivor's guilt, wishing that he could have done something more. But he was also accused of being her murderer. Because of all this, he had to leave town. He moved to Colorado with his brother. He was suffering from chronic pain and reoccurring nightmares, and that's if he could fall asleep, because he was also dealing with insomnia. Since Jason was terrified of living alone, he stayed with his brother for almost 2 years. Unfortunately, Jason's healthcare only covered about a quarter of his hospital bills, and the financial strain was debilitating for him. He was never the same after this incident. Although investigators repeatedly accused Jason of having superficial wounds, he later came forward and said that he suffered a collapsed lung as a result of the attack. There's nothing superficial about an injury like that, and looking back, I feel bad for Jason being wounded in such a traumatic way. It's mentally taxing, even if the wounds weren't as deep as the ones that killed Jonah. That emotional pain runs deep. We do not know what it's like to be in that situation, so I try really hard not to place judgment on him. After clearing Jason, investigators were even more determined to find out who the DNA belonged to. They were excited to run this DNA, and Jonah's family finally thought they were going to get answers. But there was no match in the CODIS database, and that's very frustrating. It usually means the person who committed this crime either hadn't been in trouble with the law before, or they had, but the crime didn't warrant providing a DNA sample. They were back to not having any viable leads or suspects. They needed to know who else was involved in Jonah's life and whether there was anyone they should be looking at, so they began interviewing her coworkers. Several of her coworkers from Zales thought that her murder might have something to do with what happened in the parking lot a few hours before her murder. Her manager, Diana Johnson, told police that another co-worker had walked Jonah to her car, but apparently a Chevy Blazer kept circling them as though they were watching the girls. Then, when Jonah got in her car, the SUV followed her out of the parking lot. The police looked into this but did not get any further leads. Then the neighbors started coming forward. Remember, they do not have all the details we do, so they were reporting being woken up at 4 a.m. with the sound of someone frantically pounding on their doors. At least 2 neighbors said that they heard the sound around the same time. When they were explaining this, they were thinking back through everything they knew, and they said they assumed it was the assailant, not Jonah. After Jonah's murder, Brendan Park Apartments was buzzing with rumors. When authorities were coming in and out of her unit, the common area was still being used, but the apartment complex replaced that bloody carpet within days. Then they said something, that her death was a result of domestic violence. That was not correct. This wasn't a dispute between a couple or a family member. No, this made it even worse because the media and the public did not want to stop looking in her roommate Jason's direction, even though he had been cleared by investigators. Now they were relying even more on Jason's description of the assailant and the sketch they released. Here's what it looks like. This was being passed out everywhere. Jonah's family would spend hours handing out hundreds, if not thousands of flyers throughout her community and beyond. They needed answers, no matter what it took. Her father said that he would spend the rest of his life finding out who did this to his daughter. The autopsy report had come in. There were at least 20 wounds all over Jonah's face, arms, midsection, chest, and back. Defensive wounds. It was absolutely horrifying what she went through. Jonah's manner of death was clearly homicide, and the cause was loss of blood from multiple stab wounds. Jonah died from her wounds from bleeding out. The community was so determined to find out who did this, they could not believe this person was walking among them, possibly living in the apartment complex. After the composite sketch was released in the media and distributed by Jonah's friends and family, a credible lead emerged. The tip was that there was a group of boys who had been committing robberies near Jonah's neighborhood around the same time as the murder. And one of these boys was a 19-year-old named Michael Percival. He only lived 1 to 2 miles away from Brendan Park Apartments, and he also looked very similar to the sketch, which is why this triggered someone to call in. There was also an outstanding arrest warrant for Michael regarding a totally unrelated crime, so investigators brought him in for questioning. When he was brought in, his shoes were the first thing investigators looked at. They were size 11 earth sole slip-ons with a very distinctive bottom. The shoes looked exactly like the ones that could have made the print on that cardboard in Jason's bedroom, so investigators were excited. They thought they might have found their guy. They contacted the district attorney to get a warrant to collect the shoes, as well as DNA and fingerprints. Meanwhile, while they were waiting, they began to question Michael, asking him where he was on the night of the crime. Shockingly, Michael started telling them everything. He admitted to playing a role in both Jonah's murder and Jason's stabbing. Investigators could not believe this. Michael revealed that Jason and Jonah owed money to a drug dealer. Michael was a drug dealer's friend and drove him to Brendan Park Apartments on December 6, 2004, to collect payment from Jason and Jonah. However, he was waiting, and when his friend didn't show back up to the car after a few minutes, Michael headed to Jason and Jonah's apartment. That's when he saw the drug dealer stabbing them, and he described the entire layout of the apartment in detail. There were some issues, though. The more Michael talked, the less sense his story made, and as a result, investigators started to doubt his confession. There was no match between his DNA, his fingerprints, or the shoes. According to the police, Michael just wanted to be in the spotlight. He wanted to be involved in a high-profile case. That is sick. That is such a waste of time, leading the investigators in the wrong direction. Of course, he was ruled out as a suspect, and the case came to a dead end once again. Mike and Joan Berry, along with the Knox County Sheriff's Department, announced in February 2005 a $10,000 reward for any information leading to an arrest concerning the murder of Jonah Berry. As a matter of fact, Joan called the investigators and the police every single day, asking for an update. During a press conference, Mike Berry said they needed to get the murderer of his daughter off the streets and prosecute him to the fullest extent of the law. He wanted people to keep focus on what's important, finding out who murdered Jonah on December 6, 2004. Jonah's reward fund received $5,000 from Carol's son Carrington Memorial Reward Foundation. The foundation honors Carol's son, her daughter Julie, and their friend Silvina Peloso, who were killed in 1999 by a serial killer named Cary Stayner in the Yosemite Mountains. An additional $5,000 came from an anonymous source, and eventually, the reward went up to $75,000. But even as more tips came in, nothing solid came out of them, and years went by with no answers. However, the Berry family never gave up. They pressed authorities to do more and more, especially for victims of these types of crimes. They needed to keep Jana's case alive. Even though Jana's parents lived in Georgia, they frequently drove out to Knoxville to hand out flyers and hang posters. Joan had a goal, and that was to keep her daughter in the public eye, so she would call Tennessee news stations all the time. Several grocery chains in Tennessee actually featured Jana's picture and the reward information on their delivery trucks, so as they drove up and down the interstate, investigators hoped that someone would recognize something about her case. The entire time, Joan Berry worked tirelessly for her daughter. She was also working a full-time job. It's like having two full-time jobs to dedicate yourself to. In 2007, a break came in Jana's case because of Joan and Mike's dedication to keeping their daughter's name in the public eye. On one of those many highways throughout Tennessee, a driver noticed Jana's billboard. He saw the composite sketch and thought it looked like a man he knew, someone named Taylor Olson. This tip caught investigators' attention because he did resemble the composite sketch, even more so than the guy who gave the false confession. Taylor was also a young man. He was in his early 20s and came from a very affluent family. Taylor Olson was born in 1985 in Eugene, Oregon, and had a 16-month-old son. When his family was interviewed, they said that Taylor was a creative young man who wrote incredible poems and was a talented artist. He had a loving heart and a wonderful, infectious way of making people laugh and smile. They also said that he had a passion and talent for riding dirt bikes and a deep love for animals, especially his beloved dog, Paris. He loved spending quality time with friends and family, and he definitely didn't sound like the type of guy they were looking for. Even when they showed Jason, the roommate, Taylor's picture, he could not confirm that this was the guy who stabbed him and Jana that night. Investigators were not too sure about this tip. They had already wasted their time with another guy they thought could be the suspect, and they didn't want to waste their time again. However, they realized while running his information that Taylor had been arrested before. However, it wasn't for anything like this. While investigating Taylor Olson, they noticed that he had an outstanding warrant for a probation violation, so they arrested him to bring him in for questioning. During his detention in July of 2007, Taylor Olson voluntarily provided a DNA sample. When questioned about Jana's murder, he denied any involvement at all. The DNA test results were delayed for several months due to a backlog at the crime lab, so in the meantime, Taylor Olson was just sitting in custody while investigators waited patiently for the outcome of the tests. Finally, on December 20th, 2007, investigators on Jana's case received a call that they had been waiting for. They hear this all the time and think, yes, 3 years, it's been 3 years. They have a match. Taylor Olson's DNA was a match for the blood found on the back staircase. His DNA was discovered in the hallway, the living room, the door handle, and that staircase. One of his fingerprints was on the murder weapon. Investigators were confident it was Taylor Olson who murdered Jana. Again, they brought him back in for questioning to confront him about what they had found, and once again Taylor denied killing Jana. He kept saying he didn't know how his blood could have gotten there. Investigators responded, saying, "It's because you were there. That's why." However, this time, investigators had forensic evidence at their disposal. After 2 days of interrogating him and attempting several different techniques, they finally got a confession. They had to do the good cop, bad cop routine. Despite Taylor denying it over and over again and refusing to back down, these investigators were persistent, and it paid off because he finally confessed. According to Taylor, he and a friend who lived near Jana tried to steal a car from the Brendan Park apartments. They were walking around the parking lot, pulling on the door handles of cars, looking for one that was unlocked so they could hotwire it. While another resident saw him and his friend acting suspiciously in the parking lot, he yelled at them to get out of there. Taylor's friend fled the scene, but Taylor decided to stay back and continue looking for a vehicle. He wasn't having any luck. So he decided to start trying to open some doors to apartments so he could find some keys. Doing that little thing where you look around for whose keys they are by peeking in the parking lot. He was just going to use those keys to take a car. Taylor was walking around, turning the doorknobs to see if any of the apartments had open doors, and that's when he stumbled upon Jason and Jonah's apartment. He was at the back door, turned the knob, and the door opened smoothly. He said he used his phone as a light source and illuminated the apartment, walking around in this eerie glow, trying to locate some keys. He made his way around the kitchen, the living room, and the foyer. Nothing there. That's when he went into Jonah's room as she slept. He crept beside her bed, opened her bedside table, and began rummaging through it. But as he did, he said that all of a sudden he felt a sharp pain in his arm and heard a woman's voice saying something like, "Who are you?" Taylor assumed that Jonah was sleeping with a knife and stabbed him when she saw him standing there in the room, not knowing who he was. After he realized he was stabbed, he said he panicked and tried to grab the knife. There was a struggle, and then finally, when he gained control of it, he began to frantically stab Jonah. Investigators were not buying this version of events. They believed he grabbed the knife when he was rummaging through the drawers in the kitchen. When he was unsuccessful at locating keys, he knew he was going to go into those bedrooms, and he wanted to arm himself. He went into Jonah's room, and once she woke up, she screamed. They think he stabbed her to stop her from making a scene or from identifying him. Taylor told investigators he had no recollection of Jason ever being there and did not remember injuring him or struggling with a second person. After his arraignment, while walking out of the courthouse sobbing, he told the media he didn't mean to kill Jonah, that it was an accident. He had the nerve to say, "I ruined my whole life." Joan wasn't buying this and had no pity. It was no accident that he went into Jonah's apartment and then into her room, and it was no accident that he was attempting to steal her car. Jonna Berry was in the prime of her life. She was about to get married and go back to school. He took her life. Taylor ruined Jonna's life and her family's lives, not his. $1 million bail was set for Taylor after he was charged with Jonna's murder, yet he still begged investigators to believe him, insisting it wasn't him. He even started telling a new version of events, blaming the crime on the friend he said he was with, Noah Cox. However, investigators had no doubt that they could secure a conviction against Taylor at trial because there was no other DNA or biological evidence of anyone else at that crime scene besides the two victims and this man, Taylor Olson. Mike Berry spoke at a press conference after the arrest, thanking the investigators who worked so hard on Jonah's case for their efforts. He said that he and his wife considered them more than just acquaintances. They were friends. Taylor's arrest actually occurred 2 days after Joan and Mike celebrated their 16th wedding anniversary. They described his arrest as a very meaningful gift to them. Sadly, Joan and Michael Berry would never get to see Taylor Olson in court because on March 24, 2008, 4 months before the trial was scheduled to start, Taylor Olson was found deceased in his jail cell. It was determined to be self-inflicted. Before his death, Taylor had told investigators there was no way he would stand trial, and in their grief, Jonna's parents described Taylor as taking the coward's way out. Even after so much fighting, Mike and Joan now seemed to have no chance of getting justice for their daughter. Taylor Olson left a note behind saying that it wasn't him who stabbed Jonna. In the letter, he identified the individual he believed was responsible for Jonna Berry's death, expressing that he hoped that person would be held accountable. John's father did not believe Taylor's claims. He said, "His blood was there, his DNA was there. He killed my daughter in a cowardly way and he took the coward's way out. If he wasn't really the one who murdered her, then why did he take his own life?" I pose that question to all of you because this is a sad and complicated case. A young father with his life ahead of him is accused of killing a young woman with such promise in life. What do you think? In the note that he left behind, Taylor claimed it was Noah Cox who killed Jonna. When Jonah was murdered, Noah lived across the street from the Brendan Park apartments, but Noah denies playing a role in Jonna's murder. After Taylor died, Court records were published, indicating that he was preparing a defense based on the theory that Noah Cox had killed Jonna while they were in the apartment trying to burglarize it. But again, I will repeat, there was no evidence that Noah Cox was ever at the scene of Jonna's murder, and he was never charged with any crime in connection with her death. I wanted to read you what Taylor's family wrote in his obituary. They said he went to be with the Lord unexpectedly in the early morning hours of March 24, 2008. There were specific instructions for his funeral. He requested that certain songs be played for him. This just really angered Mike Berry. He said that he didn't get to tell his daughter goodbye before she died and felt like her murderer shouldn't have a say in what happens after he dies. What do you think about that? Jonna Berry's family sued the apartment complex where she was murdered for failing to protect her. The Brendan Park Apartments settled out of court with the family, claiming that the building was not secure. Additionally, her parents criticized the sheriff's office for ignoring their concerns for assistance from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, which they had requested early on in the case. I want to end with some good news. The Berry family finally received some. A Senate committee approved the Jonna Berry Act, proposed in Tennessee to increase the odds of finding suspects by requiring violent felons to submit DNA upon arrest rather than conviction. Joan and Mike Berry believe the state had way too few DNA samples in the database. They hope the Jonna Berry Act will help other families find justice for their loved ones and make Tennessee a safer place to live. Jonna loved to help people, and this was just another way that she could do that, even in death. According to her father, eventually the Jonna Berry Act was fully enacted, and DNA is now collected on arrest rather than just after conviction. If this act had been in place before Jonna's murder, Taylor Olson might have been taken off the streets long before he killed her. To carry on Jonna's legacy and honor her love for children, her loved ones hold a holiday toy drive every year. I was hoping to get this video out before December 6th. It's just a way to pay tribute to Jonna, who was wrapping Christmas gifts for children from low-income families on the night she was murdered. This event is still going on in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia. Everyone is invited and encouraged to bring a brand new, unwrapped toy for children in need. All donated toys are delivered to the area's children's organizations, and the toys are expected to be distributed on December 6th of this year. PayPal also allows donors to make secure online donations, so I will leave that link below. The donations will be collected and given to Hope for Victims. Jonna would have accomplished remarkable things in this world if it weren't for her tragic death. She would have made a difference, and she is. We are keeping her memory alive. The Berrys were grateful for the time they had with Jonna. It was better for her to be there for this short time than to never have had her at all. One Tennessee woman was in her final year of college, just months away from graduation, and she was anxious to land a fulfilling job and get real-world experience. She told family and friends about a job offer she had gotten on the outskirts of town, but before she could start her first day, her life was brutally ended by a cold, calculated killer. This is the story of a sinister plot that left a small town shaken to its core, and when the truth finally came out, her friends and family would never be the same again. Let me introduce you to Erica Megan Sharpton, known to her family and friends as Megan or just Meg. She was born on October 24th of 1987 in Tullahoma, Tennessee. Now Tullahoma is 90 minutes south of Nashville, and it's about an hour northeast of Chattanooga on the border of Coffee County and Franklin County. Tullahoma's welcome sign says, "A city as unique as its name," but Tullahoma has a warm and welcoming vibe like most small towns. It's safe, walkable, and everyone knows everyone else. Tullahoma is also in the middle of the Bible Belt, an area of the southern United States with a more conservative religious population. Churches pepper the countryside. The nearby town of Winchester is known for Tim's Ford Lake, which is a prime location to fish, camp, and swim. On the weekends, people drive from all over Tennessee and Alabama with their boats, ready to just chill out in their lake houses with their family. Megan's mom, Kelly Elizabeth Hale Sharpton, was a graphic designer from Millen, Tennessee. Megan had an older sister named Caroline, who actually went by Carrie, and two younger brothers, Alex and Will. Later, Kelly would welcome Cameron and Lee, who are Megan's half-siblings. And if you know me, I also have half-siblings who I adore and consider to be my full siblings, and Megan was the exact same way. The family hopped around when Megan was younger, which meant that they grew very close. Megan and Carrie were attached at the hip. They cracked each other up. Megan was known for her distinctive laugh and her witty sense of humor, and once Megan got Carrie laughing, it was all over. She couldn't stop. As they say, some people have really contagious laughs, and Megan was one of them. She was a really cute kid with strawberry blonde hair and adorable freckles. She was an animal lover, a good student, and she was naturally talented at almost any hobby she set her mind to, especially drawing and painting. The Sharptons moved to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, and then Hazel Green, Alabama. That's where Megan met her lifetime best friend and sidekick, Brittany Bailey. Megan was there for Brittany through thick and thin. Middle and high school can be brutal, but they had one another. At 13, they liked to hang out after school and watch CSI and true crime TV shows. One time, Megan turned to Brittany and said that if anything ever happened to her, she would leave a trail of clues behind so that investigators could find her. She told Brittany that she would put up a fight if she went missing, and to never give up searching for her. It's pretty eerie considering what I know will happen later, but Megan assured Brittany that she was too smart for someone to take advantage of her, and Brittany agreed. Megan was intelligent, bold, and wise beyond her years. Watching true crime, both of the teens felt prepared for any dangerous situation, though at 13, they were still very naive. Brittany and Carrie said that Megan was the most compassionate person they knew. Megan was the kind of person who definitely got attention, but she never wanted to be the center of attention. She was an empath and a natural-born caretaker. It didn't matter who you were. If you were human, Megan cared about you. That open-minded, free-spirited energy was so refreshing. In high school, Megan's family moved to the Ann Arbor, Michigan area, where she attended Chelsea High School. Megan was always inviting kids to join her at the lunch table and making friends in unexpected ways. She excelled in art studio classes with her new friend, Brittany Lay. Now, Brittany liked to paint Megan's hand in class. I know it sounds kind of funny and strange, but one time, their teacher thought they should take a picture of this hand painting and actually turn it in for a grade because it was very creative and artistic. I have a picture of Megan showing off her hand, and she and Brittany thought it was pretty funny that their teacher was letting them do this for a grade. I think it's pretty creative and cool. But outside of school, Megan went out of her way to bring blankets and food to people who were experiencing homelessness, and she even became friends with them. Now, this definitely made her mother very concerned for Megan's safety, but Megan trusted people. She thought everyone deserved a friend, and I have to agree. I think the world needs more people like Megan. She was ambitious, and she wanted to either go to college to be a vet or focus on art. To save up money, Megan worked at a dry cleaning business and then graduated high school in 2006. Now the Sharptons moved to Fayetteville, Tennessee, and then back to Tullahoma. It wasn't until Megan returned to Tennessee that she set her eyes on yet another career, one where she could truly help people, and that was nursing. She took some classes at Motlow State Community College, and then worked towards her degree in practical nursing at Shelbyville's Tennessee College of Applied Technology. It's a trade school with campus locations in Tullahoma and Winchester. The program was tight-knit, and Megan had two very close friends in her cohort, Brittany Bailey and Ren Scherer. Outside of school, Megan had a larger friend group, including a guy named Chris Friel. Now in 2008, Chris and Megan got closer than friends, and they went on a few dates before they decided to make it official. She always wanted to fall in love, and she thought Chris was the one for her. They had a very passionate relationship, and friends noticed that wherever Megan went, Chris followed. They eventually became roommates and dated for almost 4 years. Over time, Megan grew into a beautiful young woman. She liked to wear her favorite color, which was purple, and tight-line her eyes with black eyeliner. Same Megan. She also loved stars, so she wore star-themed jewelry and clothing. Actually, she had a magnolia leaf tattoo on her shoulder, a small tattoo on her chest, a star tattoo on the back of her neck, and a collection of 6 stars tattooed on her foot to represent each one of her siblings. But you know what they say about tattoos. Once you get one, you become addicted, and you want to get more. They're expensive though, and Megan was paying for herself through technical school, so she definitely had to pace herself. Megan worked as a server at a Japanese steakhouse, and this was a restaurant chain with locations in Winchester and TOA. While Megan didn't love the service industry, it definitely played to her skill set, and she liked the flexible hours. I'm sure she also liked the cash tips. Megan also picked up shifts at a nearby nursing home, where she could hone in on her nursing skills. Now, combined with class and spending time with her family and friends, Megan was very busy, always going to her clinicals, shadowing, and looking for ways to break into the nursing field. She wanted to gain as much experience as possible and land a really good job. She was set to graduate at the end of summer in 2012, with the official graduation ceremony in October. The weekend before the 4th of July, her sister Carrie was visiting from out of town, and Megan was 24. Now, with several of her siblings married with families of their own, she was an aunt to 3 nieces: Chloe, Lizzie, and Bailey. Megan's younger brothers, Will and Alex, were in college. Will now lived in Chattanooga most of the year, playing football for the Mocs at UTC. For Kelly, having most of her kids out of the house meant that she was always looking for ways to get the family together. So every Sunday, they had a routine. Kelly would host a family dinner starting around 4 or 5 p.m. Megan and all of her siblings made a point to never miss a Sunday dinner unless they really had to. It was that important to them to put family first. At 3:45 on Sunday, July 1st, Megan called her mom and said that she had just woken up. Now, this was normal. Megan worked the Saturday night shift, and after a shift on your feet all night, it's hard to get to bed at a reasonable hour, so she slept in on Sundays. Megan told Kelly and Carrie she was planning to come to dinner that night, but she might be a few hours late. She explained that her plans were to take a shower and then go to a prospective job interview. It was for a private caretaking job, which can pay pretty well, so it was really important for her to miss some of the family night that night, but she promised she would swing by Kelly's house as soon as she was done with the interview. Megan said she had already done a phone interview and had pretty much gotten the job. She was just going to meet her prospective patient for the very first time to ensure it was a good fit. Megan was excited. This was a pretty lucrative gig, and she would even get a bonus up front. It was what she had been working so hard to achieve. Everything seemed like it was coming together for her. Megan and her mom Kelly were very close. She told her mom everything, and Kelly knew Megan was worried about getting enough experience in the nursing field before she graduated. She was really tired of working as a server. This new opportunity would allow her to care for an elderly patient one-on-one, putting her in a much better position after she graduated to find the job of her dreams. Before hanging up the phone, Megan told Kelly and Carrie she loved them and would see them in just a few hours. That night, dinner went by, and Megan never showed up. Kelly called Megan several times, but the calls went straight to voicemail. Now at this point, Kelly figured Megan got busy with the patient and then probably just went back to her apartment that she shared with Chris. She wasn't too worried yet and would call again in the morning when she thought Megan was awake. She was sure that Megan would have a lot to share about this new job and probably had a long night. But in the middle of that night, on July 2nd, at 1:20 a.m., just hours after Megan didn't show up at her mother's house for dinner, a group of teenagers was driving home from a friend's house when they spotted a fire on the side of a Walt road. They were in the middle of nowhere, close to Tim's Ford Lake and a Walt bridge. There weren't any houses nearby. The closest building was a church about half a mile away, and the fire was burning in a field. Since it was a hot, dry week in July, they called the authorities so that the fire wouldn't spread. The young man who called 911 spoke to the dispatcher. When the dispatcher asked for the location near the fire, he said, "That bridge going it looks like a forest fire." He turned the car around and parked near the blaze, watching, ready to call back if the fire got out of control. 10 minutes later, Officer Charles Stein of the Franklin County Sheriff's Department responded to the call. The brush fire had died down by that point, and as he approached, the teenagers motioned to where the fire was still smoking. He could tell by the expressions on their faces that this was something more than a brush fire. The teenagers had gotten closer to the fire in an attempt to put it out, and that's when they noticed the body. When Officer Stein got close enough, he realized that he was looking at the partially clothed and charred body of a deceased young white female, lifeless on the burning ground. She was lying in a patchy part of the grass, several meters from a wooded area, with no other evidence as to how she got there. He wasn't sure if a car had just backed into this area and dropped her there or what. But to him, at first glance, this did not look like where she had been killed. Instead, this appeared to be a dump site. Stein called the department to send out backup, including detectives from the homicide department. In the meantime, he went about extinguishing the rest of the fire. He knew, in order to preserve the scene, he could not use a fire extinguisher because the powder and chemicals would destroy evidence. But he did have sterile water in the back of his police cruiser, usually used to collect specimens like blood droplets on swabs. He brought it over and used it to put out the rest of the flames. Then he attended to the teenagers who had made the call because they were traumatized by what they had found. They were asked to remain at the scene and wait for detectives to arrive so they could get a full account of everything they witnessed. Homicide Detective George D. responded to the call, as well as Detective Todd Hinman. This was the very first homicide case that Hinman had ever led, and he was determined from the beginning to do everything right. Dyer and Hinman both commented that the crime scene looked like something straight out of a horror movie. The young woman was blonde, possibly in her 20s, though her face and hair were covered in soot. Her shirt was also covered in soot, but from the waist down, she was not clothed. Rigor mortis had already set in, but the fire couldn't have burned for more than an hour, so the investigators hypothesized that she had been killed before the fire was set. What's more, the fire appeared to have been set between her legs. Because of this, Dyer and Hinman assumed that this crime was of a sexual nature, and that her killer had tried to burn the evidence. That's where most of the damage was actually concentrated. The young woman had visibly sustained blunt force trauma to the head. As the detectives were examining her, they noticed they could actually feel the broken bones in her head shift when they gently moved it from side to side to determine what her injuries were. An autopsy would be required to be certain because it was hard to tell from all the burns and soot. As far as the surrounding scene was concerned, there wasn't a murder weapon in sight. In fact, there was nothing in sight. No phone, no purse, no ID, no discarded clothing, and no sign of a struggle. The only thing they noted was her t-shirt, which had some kind of emblem for a nursing program on it. They wondered if she was a student, an educator, or even a nurse. They figured she was most likely a student, judging by what they thought her age might be. Without much to go on, and with no way to identify her, Detective Hinman took note of the victim's visible tattoos, including the magnolia flower on her shoulder, the star tattoo behind each of her ears, and the stars on her ankle. If a person is kidnapped or murdered, it can help identify them, and speed is key when it comes to investigations. As morbid as that might sound, tattoos can withstand a lot of damage, even decomposition, so they really do provide telling signs to a victim's identity. Fortunately, the detectives did find some tire tracks, but then realized they couldn't make plaster molds of them because they were in gravel. If they tried, the gravel would just get stuck to the plaster, so the tracks weren't much use except to further their theory that the victim had been killed somewhere else, and the killer had driven to this rural location to dispose of her body. It's disgusting, heartless, and so violent and cold-blooded. One of the detectives, Rob Tips, made a comment that a killer only burns a body for two main reasons. One, to destroy evidence, and two, because they're evil and have immense hatred for their victim. Next, Detective Hinman interviewed the 911 callers. You know, it's not uncommon for people to call in a crime that they're actually part of, so a few of these young men could have been close to the victim's age. The detectives wondered if they had anything to do with it, but they looked very disturbed, and they didn't seem to know anything about this young woman. According to them, they'd been hanging out at a friend's house playing pool for the entire evening. They were completely sober, and all of them corroborated each other's story. So, at this point, Hinman ruled them out as suspects and allowed them to go home. They did all provide their information, so if needed, they could be called back in. It takes hours to process a crime scene, and they still weren't any closer to figuring out who this girl was. And by the time they were finished, it was light outside, and they had more questions than answers. They took pictures of the body, as well as the tattoos, and Sheriff Tim Fuller posted the young woman's description on Facebook. Since it was Monday morning, everyone was getting up early, checking their social media before they went to work. Within just an hour, the department had 5 calls from concerned parents, and one of them was from Megan's mother, Kelly Sharpton. Kelly was at the Arnold Engineering Development Complex, which is a base for the U.S. Air Force, where she did graphic design. She sat at her cubicle, logged into her computer, and checked Facebook. That is when she saw the post about a Jane Doe that had been found deceased. The post described a young woman, blonde, possibly a nursing student, with star tattoos, and it asked anyone, friends or family members of anyone that would be missing, to contact the sheriff's office. When Kelly read the part about the star tattoos, she screamed in the middle of her office. She had just talked to Megan yesterday, but this sounded exactly like her daughter's description, especially because of the star tattoos. Kelly immediately contacted Detective Hinman, and they talked for a few minutes as he asked her to provide details about her daughter. As she did, the detective confirmed that Kelly's daughter's characteristics sounded very similar to their victim. So, Kelly was asked to drive to the station for a formal interview and to identify the body. As she tried to pull her emotions together, the detectives attempted to gather more information about Megan and her last known whereabouts so they could find out who did this to her. Kelly gave all the information she could, but she was in shock. She did her best to try to tell them everything she knew, that she had spoken to Megan after she got out of class and just before her shift at the steakhouse where she worked. When Megan didn't show up for dinner, Kelly said she kept calling, but the calls, like I had told you, had gone to voicemail. She also let them know that Megan drove a 1995 red Mustang. That was an important clue because no vehicles had been found in the vicinity of Megan's body. So they decided to put out a bolo for Megan's car all across Tennessee and Alabama. After this, detectives let Kelly go home and grieve with her family. When Megan's sister, Carrie, got home, she found Kelly wailing, and she asked what was wrong. Kelly said that somebody killed her last night. Carrie didn't understand who. She couldn't process the words, and then she realized it was Megan. But she thought, it can't be Megan. Carrie was in denial. When Kelly said it again, she could not process the information. She felt an overwhelming sense of loss. It would take weeks to get it through her head that she would never hear her little sister's laugh ever again. Detective Hinman and Dyer interviewed Carrie next. Carrie explained that she spoke to Megan the evening before, on Sunday around 4 or 5 p.m., and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Megan seemed fine. I mean, anything could have happened to her after 4 p.m. When Dyer asked Carrie if she thought of anyone who would want to hurt Megan, Carrie just blurted out, "Chris did it." Yep, without a moment of hesitation, Carrie already had a prime suspect in mind. That was the only thing that made sense to Carrie, knowing all she did about her sister and her relationship with Chris, Megan's boyfriend of 4 years. When Dyer asked why Carrie thought Chris was responsible, she said it took a lot to get Megan mad, but with Chris, she had a very short fuse. That's because he had a quick temper. As Carrie gave the detectives a rundown on Megan and Chris's relationship, it was clear that the couple were like oil and water, they did not mix. Now every relationship does have its ups and downs, but theirs was going downhill. The couple started out really strong when they were younger. They were carefree, they were inseparable. But over time, with Megan taking her education and her career more seriously, and Chris not really ready to grow up and get out of the party phase, they began to clash. This was news to the officers because Kelly had briefly mentioned Chris in her interview, but she didn't give them any information about thinking Chris could be involved. But even if you are super close with your mom, you don't always tell her everything because you don't want her to worry about you. You don't tell her the same things you might tell your sisters. Maybe Megan felt comfortable telling Carrie the secret truths about her relationship with Chris, and maybe she tried to spare her mother. Carrie said that he was the only person who was with Megan every day, knew her schedule, and had access to her, which gave him an opportunity to do her harm. So Detective Hyman and Investigator Tips asked Carrie for Chris and Megan's address. The first thing they noticed when they showed up was that Megan's car was not there. However, Chris was home, as well as his roommate, Robbie. Chris was upset. He had already heard about what happened to Megan because the word traveled fast. Chris told Hinman that the night before, he was actually concerned about Megan. He said that when he was at work, he called Megan on his smoke break and it just went to voicemail. Then when he got back to the apartment, Megan wasn't home, but Chris just figured that she spent the night with her mom and her sisters after going over there for dinner because it was a holiday and he knew all of her siblings would be around. But the next morning, Megan had not called or texted him. He claimed he reached out to Kelly, and then Kelly broke the news to him. He said he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary with Megan. When asked if they could search the apartment, he gave them consent. They went through that place from top to bottom. Investigator Tips saw what he thought was some blood in one of the bathrooms, and they also found a couple of unused syringes in Robbie's bedroom. They weren't sure if any of this was connected to what happened to Megan, but they collected the evidence and told both men they needed to come down to the station for formal interviews. But before they could even question Chris and Robbie any further, Hinman got a call. Megan's Mustang had been found in Bedford County. Now the car was parked on the side of Three Forks Bridge Road, a country road northeast of Tullahoma and close to Shelbyville. It was a 30-minute drive from a wall bridge where Megan's body was found. Now another department was in on this investigation, and Hinman had to rush to get to Megan's car to process the evidence. He wondered if this could be where the initial crime took place. Megan's Mustang was in another rural area without any signage, and it was a really odd place and an odd way to leave a car. It was just sitting there on the side of the road. When Hinman looked inside, it was cluttered. There were random things in the front and back seats, a water bottle, a lighter, and a cigarette pack, but that's pretty typical of a young person. There was also nothing out of place, no visible signs of blood, no phone, wallet, purse, or keys. However, there was a handwritten note. It was kind of tucked between the center console and the passenger seat. Now that stood out among anything else. The handwriting was neat and bubbly, so Hinman assumed Megan probably wrote this note. It said, "Past 276 highway, right off highway, no signs," with no signs underlined, and then small bridge with the address 850 Chaw Road underneath it. Clearly, these were directions to a location. The note was, like I said, close to the driver's seat, so it made sense that Megan was probably on her way to that location before she was killed. I looked at it, and the way it was kind of in between that seat and the console reminded me of back in the day with MapQuest printouts. I would do the exact same thing, or I would have it laying on the passenger seat. The detectives knew that Megan was on her way to a new job, so they wondered, could these be directions to that location? Hinman was not familiar with this area, so he called the Bedford County Sheriff, who said that he also didn't know of a Chaw Road. In fact, when they put this location into Google Maps, the location didn't even exist. However, they did notice a Schnare Road right next to where Megan's car was found. There was no address of 850 Schnare either. However, the area over there on Schnare is also very rural. Bridge Road, which is where Schnare naturally leads as you just keep going forward. But why did she stop there? Did she pull over to get her bearings straight and then somehow come face to face with evil? Or did someone lure Megan to this location? Was she abducted and then taken to another location to be killed? Did Chris have something to do with this? After all, Megan was smart. She wouldn't just drive to an address that didn't exist, would she? Megan must have trusted the person who gave her those directions. Now that the detectives had the car, they sent it to the Nashville Crime Lab, and Hinman went back to interview Chris and Robbie. By this point, Chris was distraught when he was being interviewed, and he said he had an alibi. He worked as a cashier at a local department store, and on July 1st, before he left for work, Megan had told him that she had accepted that job offer and that a friend from her nursing school actually recommended Megan for the job. She also let Chris know she would return the next morning, most likely because she had plans to go straight to her mom's after the job interview, and she'd probably be there late hanging out with her family, so she would just sleep over. Chris said he got to work at the store around 5. Man stayed until midnight, while his roommate Robbie stayed home. But that didn't mean anything until Hinman got his hands on security footage. When asked about the blood in the bathroom, Chris seemed really surprised at first, but then he recalled he had a bloody nose. Well, Hinman wasn't so sure. Chris looked really nervous and was visibly shaking. I mean, what are the chances, right? A bloody nose at the same time your girlfriend turns up murdered? I do know from other cases that I've worked on that bloody noses aren't that uncommon, especially in certain weather, but still. That prompted Detective Hinman to ask Chris if he and Megan had a good relationship. Chris said yes, insisting he would never hurt her. So, Hinman asked if Robbie would hurt Megan, and Chris said no. He trusted Robbie. They were really good friends. Hinman then asked Chris if he knew anything about what Megan was doing leading up to this new job offer on July 1st. Chris recalled that the day before, Saturday, June 30th, while Megan was at work, the phone rang and he picked it up. A guy had called the phone at Megan's apartment asking to get in touch with her about a job offer. Now, Chris remembered Megan telling him that she listened to the voicemail and called the guy back on her personal cell phone. When Megan called this guy back, that's when he offered her the job. He had gotten her number from a woman in her nursing program and had heard really good things about Megan's work ethic and that she would be graduating soon, so she was the ideal candidate for the position. The man explained he needed someone to care for his elderly grandmother. So initially, Megan interviewed with this man over the phone. She was asked about her abilities, the hours she would be available, and she got all the details. After the call, the man offered her the job, and Megan accepted. Then the guy invited her to come meet his grandmother on Sunday night to make sure it was a good fit for both of them. Other than that, Chris told Detective Hinman he really didn't know much else, just that the person recommending Megan was a nursing student named Naomi, who Megan had classes with. But after everything Carrie had told Hinman, he felt that Chris was leaving something out, so he questioned him further about the so-called good relationship with Megan. Chris said they were just like any other couple. They tried to make it work despite their arguments, which had definitely increased since Megan and Chris moved in together. Being roommates can either make or break a relationship, even platonic ones. Chris also mentioned that some of the tension was around Megan's impending graduation. She was ready to start her career, and Chris was so happy for her, but he was still young and wild and free. He worked, but he just didn't have the same ambition as Megan. He wasn't at that stage in his life yet. So when you're young and want different things in life, that could put a lot of pressure on a relationship and create misunderstandings and strife. Detective Hinman then asked Chris if the relationship ever got physical, and Chris said no. He would never lay a finger on Megan. He loved her. But remember how confident Carrie was about thinking Chris was responsible for what happened to Megan? If he was, of course, he would deny hurting her and insist the relationship was good and that he would never hurt her. But so far, there was also no direct evidence against him. Next, Detective Hinman talked with Robbie. Now he was Chris's friend before moving in recently, and this is when things took an unexpected turn. Robbie had a much different personality than Chris. He was more reserved and serious, with a little bit of a darker personality. He wasn't a happy-go-lucky kind of guy. Instead, he was more withdrawn. He looked at Hinman straight in the eye and said, "Look, I'm not the killer. I want y'all to find out who killed Megan." That was convincing, but Hinman felt that Robbie was acting shady. Robbie had just moved into the apartment. What are the odds that his move and Megan's murder lined up? On July 1st, Robbie didn't have an alibi at all. He was alone in their apartment from 5 p.m. when Chris left to midnight when Chris returned and saw him there. What if Megan got home and Robbie was waiting for her, then killed her and got rid of the evidence? Robbie wanted to prove that he was concerned about Megan, so he showed Detective Hinman his text messages between him and her throughout the night and even into the early morning hours. He was texting back and forth with Megan, and then she just stopped answering. But Robbie kept texting, asking if Megan was okay. Robbie had texted her considerably more than her own boyfriend, Chris. So was he just texting her to maybe pretend he was concerned and create an alibi for himself? Because that's what it looked like to the detectives, so they decided to put a little more heat on him. Heyman confronted Robbie with the syringes and the needles that they found in his room, and Robbie admitted that he was battling addiction in secret. He said that neither Chris nor Megan knew he was doing drugs, and they definitely didn't know he was keeping those items in the house. The paraphernalia had nothing to do with Megan's case, nor did the blood in Chris's bathroom. But with this new information, Heyman asked if Robbie was keeping anything else a secret. Robbie was honest. He said that in the month since he moved in, he and Megan had turned from acquaintances to friends, and then recently it had turned into more than friends. A few weeks ago, they both acted on their feelings, and they knew they wanted to be together. That's why Robbie was texting her so much. Robbie said it was a secret, and Chris didn't know. But Megan had actually discussed wanting to break up with Chris and was planning to do it very soon. They didn't know how to tell Chris because they both cared about him. But the detectives wondered, could Chris have found out and become angry? Had Chris concocted this entire story about some job interview so that he could meet Megan on this rural, desolate road and hurt her? Or did he hurt her in the house and then abandon Megan's car, crafting that note to lead the detectives off track? Another theory detectives had was that maybe Megan told Robbie she didn't want to break up with Chris, and it was Robbie who got angry and might be responsible. Hinman knew that when it came to love triangles, there were dozens of scenarios and plenty of room for jealous rage, so he went back and spoke to Chris again. This time, he was blunt. He told Chris he had information from Robbie that Megan planned to leave him and start dating Robbie instead. Chris looked flabbergasted, as if he had no idea, and then he got really upset. Hinman pressed him more and more, saying it made sense why he would want to murder Megan if he knew she planned to leave him for his friend. Chris collected himself and then said no. He didn't know what happened to Megan, and even if she had planned to leave him or had left him for Robbie, he would never hurt her. He still loved her. If anything, this was a violation of the bro code he had between him and his friend. He let Robbie into his home, and then Robbie stole his girlfriend. Chris and Robbie both agreed to take polygraph tests. They were asked very pointed questions like, "Did you kill Megan?" By the end of the day, after many different questions, they both passed. You can pass a polygraph and still be lying. They aren't a true method of ascertaining the truthfulness of someone's statements. Robbie and Chris were still suspects, but they had moved significantly down the list until further investigative measures could be taken to either eliminate them or prove they were involved. Carrie still thought Chris was responsible, while on the contrary, Megan's friend Brittany thought Robbie was responsible. Megan had gone to Brittany in the weeks before she was murdered and confided that she and Chris had drifted apart. She told Brittany she loved Robbie. Brittany hadn't met Robbie yet, but from Megan's description, she believed he could be a little rough around the edges. Now, Brittany didn't know about Robbie's struggles with addiction at the time, but she still thought Robbie had done this. And you know what? So did Detective Hinman. But as an investigator, those biases can give you tunnel vision and cloud your understanding of the entire case, so Heyman fought to keep an open mind. By the end of the day on July 2nd, news had spread all across town and beyond. Actually, Nancy Grace even talked about this case on her show, so it was definitely getting a lot of publicity. Megan's instructor at her nursing school had the impossible task of telling Megan's friends and classmates in her program about what happened. Megan's close friend Ren got a call from the instructor, and she thought for sure it had something to do with her grades or an assignment because of the seriousness in the teacher's tone. But then she got the shock of her life when she heard the words, "I think Megan is dead." It confused Ren. She had just seen Megan. What did she mean she was dead? But the teacher explained that she heard the news that Megan had actually been murdered, and then it finally hit Ren. She said she didn't usually cry that often, but when she heard the news about Megan, she cried harder than she ever had before and screamed at the top of her lungs. Many people in the community actually wondered if there could be a serial killer passing through town. After all, Megan had been found on the side of the road, and it was the weekend before the 4th of July, so there were plenty of people coming into town from all over to hang out at the lake. The thought of some evil person walking free down their small streets was enough to keep them up at night. The only information that Detective Heineman had at this point that stood out was that call from the man offering Megan a job, so he decided to dig a little deeper into this job offer. He didn't have much to go on, but he knew the name Naomi from talking to Chris. Now, Heyman was able to gain access to records from Megan's practical nursing program, and there was no one currently enrolled with the name Naomi. However, there was a Naomi Jones who had graduated the year prior, and they would have been in class together. Her address was still on file. Naomi lived on a street called Bell Drive, in a cute brick house in a nice suburban subdivision. Heyman pulled up to her home, walked up and knocked on the door. No one was home, but instead of calling it a day, he pulled a lawn chair out from his vehicle, placed it in front of the house, and Detective Heineman just sat there for over an hour, waiting for Naomi to return. I love detectives who actually go above and beyond. Now, he was in plain clothes, so when one of Naomi's concerned neighbors came over and asked what he was doing, I also appreciated neighbors who look out for one another. Heineman explained he was a detective investigating the murder of a local woman named Megan Sharpton and that he needed to speak to Naomi Jones. The neighbor knew Naomi, so he gave her a call and then handed the phone to Heyman so he could talk to her. Heyman told Naomi he was Detective Todd Heyman from the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and that he was investigating the death of a young woman named Megan Sharpton. He had some questions for Naomi and wanted to know, first and foremost, if Naomi even knew Megan Sharpton. Naomi said they had been in class together during Megan's junior year, but that she didn't know Megan all that well outside of class. They weren't friends, they didn't hang out. They were just in the same nursing program at the time and had done clinicals together, but that was it. Hinman then asked Naomi whether she had ever recommended Megan for a nursing job. Naomi said she didn't know about any job offers and that she wouldn't recommend Megan for anything. Now Heyman was kind of confused by the way that Naomi phrased that. Naomi wouldn't recommend Megan, or she hadn't recommended her. He felt like Naomi was implying that she didn't really like Megan. At least that's how it came off. But maybe Naomi just meant she didn't know Megan well, so why would she recommend her for a job? That makes sense, as in, I wouldn't recommend her for anything because I don't know her very well. Heyman really didn't feel like he gained anything new from their conversation, except that either Chris had heard who recommended Megan for this job, or it was a different Naomi. The sheriff's office put a call out for tips, and on Wednesday, July 4th, a man called the station saying he'd found a pink purse while fishing in Rock Creek Greenway. Inside this purse was Megan's driver's license and her social security card, but they still hadn't located her cell phone. Now, I'm going to show you where this purse was found on this map. If you are watching this video, it's right here, near a popular fishing spot, and it's closer to the place where Megan's body was found on a Walt Road, only about a 14-minute drive. Her car was then found further away, up on Three Forks Bridge Road. Remember, that is where those directions kind of led. So either Megan was near the creek when she was killed, or the perpetrator had actually taken her things there to a separate location, just to throw investigators off and make it harder for them to piece all this evidence together. I think it's crazy that this purse was even found, but then again, it probably stood out. You'd think if you were really trying to get rid of evidence, you would do something more than just throw it near a popular fishing spot. But because Megan's phone wasn't in her purse, detectives requested her phone records from her provider as well as GPS tracking data. However, all of that can take weeks to process, even up to 6 months. They were really hoping it would give them an idea of the series of events that took place before Megan was murdered. Megan's autopsy results had come back by this time, and now Detective Hinman was able to finally update her family on the investigation. The past few days had been so hard on her mom, Kelly, and her sister, Carrie. Kelly's energy had slowly faded over the course of the week, and Carrie was really hoping they would solve this case soon, because their mother wasn't the same, which is to be expected. The case was consuming Kelly's every moment. The autopsy was even more difficult to process. Megan's manner of death was, of course, homicide, and her cause of death was a gunshot wound to the cheek that had an upward trajectory and appeared to be at point-blank range. When she was initially found, the officers had not seen this gunshot wound because of all the black soot that was covering her face and head. She also sustained blunt force trauma to the head, and her skull was broken into several pieces. The coroner believed that she was most likely hit with the gun. The bullet was believed to be a .22 caliber belonging to a pistol and was sent to the lab for ballistic testing. Now, to wound someone directly in the face, you have to be really cold-blooded. That is very personal. It's up close, or it's just plain evil. Either way, I can't even begin to imagine the heartache that her family was feeling. Knowing what happened to her in her final moments makes my stomach turn, and I am so sorry. But now there was even a little bit of positive news regarding catching this killer. Despite the fire's damage, DNA from a male perpetrator in the form of semen was recovered from inside Megan's body. The DNA was then sent to the crime lab. The man's attempt to erase the evidence had been unsuccessful. There is a common misconception that fires burn hot enough to destroy evidence. But in this case, the fire actually created more evidence. Not only did it preserve the male DNA, but it also narrowed down the time frame in which Megan was deceased. Megan's autopsy showed no signs of smoke inhalation, meaning that the fire was set after she was attacked. Arson analysts determined that the fire was set around 1:18 a.m. I don't know how they know this, but this was the time they gave, which meant that the 911 call that came in around 12:20 a.m. actually occurred just minutes after the perpetrator left that fiery scene. We also know that rigor mortis sets in after a few hours, which means that Megan was killed long before she was set on fire. Her time of death was somewhere between 5 p.m. and 11 p.m., when Chris said that he was at work, and Robbie would have apparently just been home alone. After this, Heyman wanted to confirm Chris's alibi, so he went to the department store and gained access to the surveillance footage. It turned out Chris worked until midnight, just like he said. If Megan's car was near Shelbyville and she was found close to Winchester, that didn't give Chris very long to commit murder before 1:20 a.m. Therefore, he was ruled out as a suspect, but he might know more than he was letting on. A week and a half after Megan's murder, the case was receiving national attention. People were calling in tips left and right, and the Sharpton family began raising money for a reward, but there were no promising leads. It was scary. This was the biggest case Toom had seen in decades. People in the surrounding towns were double-checking their doors and windows. They were scared to leave their houses. No one was going out at night without either a friend or their partner. Rumors were also spreading quickly, and Hunman was inundated with calls about another case. Yet another young blonde, a 20-year-old nursing student named Holly Bobo. She had gone missing from Darden, Tennessee in October of 2011, about 9 months before Megan was found. Even though Darden was a 2.5-hour drive away, people couldn't help noticing the similarities between Holly's case and Megan's. Holly had apparently been abducted right from her home, and Detective Dyer responded to several calls asking if there was a serial killer on the loose targeting nursing students for some reason. So he personally reached out to Decatur County law enforcement and explored possible connections between Megan and Holly's cases. By this time in Megan's case, her car came back from the crime lab after 3 weeks. Unfortunately, there was nothing of evidentiary value found inside or on the outside of the vehicle. Another dead end. It had been nearly a month, and Detective Hinman was starting to lose hope. That's when he got a call from Megan's boyfriend, Chris. Chris wanted to help. He was kind of already helping by doing his own investigation and had been really digging into Megan's job offer. He called Heyman to tell him he realized the initial offer actually came through on an old phone Megan used to use but no longer did because she had gotten a new one. I don't know how that all works because I thought if you got a new one, everything would be transferred over, but this was 2012, so maybe it was different back then. Chris checked the call log and found a record of the initial missed call from this unknown phone number that wasn't programmed into her phone, so he gave that number to detectives. When they called, nobody answered, but now they had a number they could trace. Usually when you're tracing calls back to an owner, you get a full report, the owner's name, address, email, and phone carrier. But when Detective Hinman traced this call back, he found out it belonged to a burner phone. I am sure most of you know what a burner phone is. They're cheap prepaid phones you can just buy at the last minute. They're unregistered, and there's no connection to the owner. They're called burners because they're typically connected to crimes and are disposed of after they're used for the crime. Therefore, they're burned or thrown away. But there are also normal, innocent reasons to buy a burner phone. Maybe you don't want to pay a bunch of money for a cell phone contract, or be locked in, or your phone number has been compromised, and you're getting a bunch of spam messages from bots. Maybe you need a second phone for work. But there are also a number of sketchy reasons to buy a burner. A secret relationship, drug deals, human trafficking, or maybe because you committed a murder. Detective Heyman could trace the number to where it was purchased. It was a store in T, so he called the store's loss prevention department. He actually knew the woman in charge. He had known her since childhood, she was willing to help do whatever she could. Well, he asked to get receipts of all the burner phone sales from the day that phone was activated and a few days before and after, and then to look up all the footage from those sales on security cameras. There were about a dozen sales. Most of the people purchasing these burner phones didn't raise any red flags, except for one, because they would also be looking for a guy. Remember? So there was this guy in the footage. He was wearing a white shirt and a baseball cap, and you couldn't really see his face, but that's one red flag, hiding his face. The other thing that caught Detective Hinman's attention was that this guy already had a cell phone. He could see it on the counter in the footage, but he's buying a burner phone for $20, so there had to be a reason he needed this phone. It wasn't because he just needed a phone in general, because he already had one. This also took place just 1 week before Megan's murder, and on top of all that, he paid in cash, so his name wasn't on file. As they're watching this footage, he walks out of the store, all the way across the parking lot, almost out of sight of the cameras, to a red pickup truck. But the camera is way too far away to get a license plate, so obviously, this guy has something to hide. He parked so far away, so Hinman froze the footage and took screenshots, and then he sent these screenshots to everyone in the department, hoping that someone knew who this guy was. Literally just minutes later, he got a text from another officer saying he knew who it was. A guy named Timothy G. Ford. Timmy, as people called him. He was a known local marijuana dealer. So now, Detective Hinman put out yet another bolo. This was to local law enforcement for a red pickup and Timmy himself. It was now mid-September, and the next day, on September 24th, a Tuma detective said Timmy was working part-time at an upholstery store. So Hinman went over there, found Timmy at the store, and told him to come back to the station because he was a suspect in a murder case. Now, Hinman told Timmy it was clear he killed Megan. He showed him the footage of Timmy buying that burner phone. Hinman said he needed to come clean because they were going to prove it with DNA evidence. The detectives had a theory. He targeted Megan for unknown reasons, bought the burner phone, called her on her old number, pretending to have a job offer for her just to lure her into the wilderness where he could abduct her and then later kill her and dispose of her body by burning it. Well, Timmy denied that he had anything to do with Megan's death. He said he didn't know who Megan was, and he didn't want to be arrested because he was innocent. He even said he bought the burner phone for a friend. It wasn't even his. Sure, the detectives definitely weren't buying it. Hinman then challenged Timmy, saying that they found it very strange that he'd be buying this phone for someone else. But Timmy interrupted and said, No. I bought it from my friend Donnie. He just had surgery and he couldn't drive, so I was helping him out. In return, Donnie was giving Timmy some of his pain pills. That was their little agreement. Timmy considered it to be fair payment. He didn't explain what kind of surgery this Donnie person had gotten that made him unable to drive, but I guess if you're on painkillers, you probably shouldn't be driving. Timmy then said he borrowed Donnie's red truck to go buy the burner phone, so the truck didn't belong to him either. It was all Donnie's. Sure. So of course the detectives wanted to know more. Timmy explained that not too long after he got him the burner phone, Donnie wanted Timmy's help negotiating a deal between Donnie and Timmy's brother Paul. Timmy explained that Donnie had started sending him pictures, saying he needed Timmy's help. He needed him to babysit his kids. He was trying to get a new vehicle. He wanted to trade in his red pickup truck for a Mustang. Timmy thought that was really odd, and he tried to tell Donnie, "You don't want a Mustang," because he's got 3 kids. So instead, Timmy played the middleman between Donnie and his brother Paul and tried to convince Donnie to trade in his pickup for Paul's Dodge Durango instead. Now, Timmy didn't know Megan drove a Mustang, but that's another weird coincidence that this Donnie person happened to say he wanted a Mustang. Weird. But what Timmy thought was weird was that Donnie would even want a Mustang because he had an infant and 2 7-year-old twins to take to and from school. Paul's Durango was much bigger, so that trade made more sense, and they made it happen. But when Paul got the truck from Donnie, all the carpet interiors were replaced. Donnie had purchased new door panels, and the car was detailed to the extreme. If you're gonna sell a truck, it makes sense to clean it, but Paul agreed to trade cars as is. They didn't have to do anything to it. He asked why the inside was brand new, and Donnie said his wife suggested it because he planned to sell it. So, make it look nice so you could sell it quicker. Paul was happy. I mean, who's gonna turn down a brand new interior of a truck? But you don't clean a car like that unless something happened in that car, and you don't just go around trading your car unless you don't want receipts or a paper trail to show you got rid of it. Very suspicious. But it did seem like Timmy was telling the truth. So, Heyman applied for a search warrant for this red truck. In the meantime, he went about locating this Donnie person who was actually well known to the Franklin County Sheriff's Office for a number of reasons. Donnie Jones was a 37-year-old with 12 prior convictions, including forgery, stealing, drug dealing, and he had been accused, not convicted but accused, of taking advantage of young women. He served time, and afterward he actually worked as a police informant. I'm sure you know what this is. Someone with a criminal lifestyle who cuts a deal with the police to provide information and help arrest other criminals. So informants have connections in the drug trafficking world, and police will turn a blind eye to their criminal behavior so they can allow the informant to meet even more dangerous criminals, allowing them to make even bigger busts. It's interesting that police informants have been around as long as police, and there are a lot of debates on whether it's ethical to keep allowing this practice, but I guess it works. Donnie was well known to police and had been out of jail for quite some time. Now the question was, how would he know Megan Sharpton, and what would be his connection to any of this and to her murder? Detective Heyman found Donnie's address, and that's when he realized Donnie Frank Jones Jr. lived on Belier Drive, just like Naomi. But he didn't just live on the same street, he lived in the same house because Naomi, Megan's former classmate in nursing school, was Donnie Jones's wife. Wow, the wheels are starting to turn, things are starting to make sense. There's a connection. Hinman knew this guy had to be involved in Megan's murder. He just had to figure out the details of how Donnie orchestrated this crime and how he was going to arrest him. Hinman went to Donnie and Naomi's house once again on September 25th, 12 weeks after Megan's murder, and knocked on their door. Donnie was kind of a big guy. He was over 6 feet tall, and he had a hairstyle that can only be described by me as micro bangs. The officers asked Donnie if he knew Megan Sharpton and if he had anything to do with her murder. Donnie said he never had any contact with Megan. The officer said, "But you did know her?" And Donnie said, "Yeah, I did know her. I don't know much about her, but he knew of her." So the officer asked, "When was the last time you talked to Megan?" Donnie told them he doesn't talk to her. He's never talked to her. But then he said, "Wait, I take that back." He told them when his wife was going to school one day, both of the girls needed a ride because the weather was bad. He described this time when Megan and Naomi went to their clinicals during Megan's junior year here, and it was raining. So Donnie and Naomi picked up Megan, and she rode in the back of their car. Donnie said he didn't really talk to her during that time, and he never saw her again. Very interesting. If Donnie wasn't going to admit to having a conversation with Megan, maybe he would admit to purchasing the burner phone to call her. But Donnie said he never asked Timmy to purchase a phone for him. Wow. So did Timmy borrow Donnie's car to pin the blame on him? Or was Donnie lying? The officers were not sure, but it was clear that Megan and Donnie definitely had a connection. Donnie said he had nothing to hide. When asked what he was doing the night of July 1st, he said he was at home watching his kids. He said that having a 9-month-old and 2 7-year-olds meant that he did nothing but be a dad. He didn't exactly say it like that. He actually threw around the F word a few times, saying, "I'm with my kids all the effing time. That's all I effing do." Sounds like he's really happy about but being at home with your kids isn't an alibi, especially at that age. They can't vouch for him. Detectives knew from Timmy that Donnie would ask Timmy to babysit when he was busy, and Naomi could have been looking after the kids at night. So the officers asked Donnie if they could search his house, and he said no. He said that his lawyer had told him it was a bad idea to let officers search his house without a warrant. That was a problem. The officer did not have probable cause to get a warrant at this time because they weren't sure what they would be searching for, and they couldn't tie the specific house to Megan or her murder. However, they could put Donnie under surveillance and dig into his personal life even more. So that's what they did. But surprisingly, Donnie did end up consenting to providing a DNA swab, and I think I know why he wasn't concerned about that, but let's just wait. One afternoon, while they were doing surveillance on him, September 26th, the day after they knocked on his door, they spoke to a little boy who came up to an unmarked police car. The little boy asked the men inside if they were cops, and he explained that he wanted to be a cop one day, but that his daddy told him not to talk to them. Then he mentioned that his dad took him shooting all the time. Well, they asked this little boy if his dad was Donnie Jones, and he said yes. Well, Donnie was a convicted felon. He was not supposed to be in possession of a firearm. This gave them the probable cause to search his home. The next day, on September 27th, they went out there with a search warrant. They made their entrance in a bold way, with .45 caliber Glocks. They raided his home, and even with a rifle pointed right at him, Donnie still acted really cocky and almost caused a scene. Detective Tips said he had already prepared himself to use his firearm if anything got out of hand, but lucky for Donnie, he cooperated and they searched the premises. The search of his home and vehicle took 9 hours, but they found exactly what they were looking for, a reason to arrest him. Donnie owned a .30 caliber hunting rifle, which he kept in the trunk of his car. This was the only gun they found, and it did not shoot .22 caliber bullets like the one that was found on Megan's body. There was also no evidence of Megan's murder in this home. No clothing, no blood. However, like I explained, Donnie was a convicted felon, so he couldn't register guns in his name. It's illegal to possess an unregistered firearm, so Donnie was arrested and taken to Coffee County Jail. At least they had him where they wanted him until they could prove he murdered Megan. Around the same time, the red truck that used to be Donnie's was being processed. The interior of the truck was heavily sanitized. There was no DNA evidence tying the truck to the crime, and Heyman was frustrated. He updated the Sharptons on the case once again, showing Carrie the surveillance footage of Timmy buying that burner phone. Carrie said she had never seen Timmy in her life. He asked Carrie and Kelly if they had ever seen or heard about Donnie Jones, and neither of them had. It made the murder feel even more senseless to them. The fact that no one was behind bars while family and friends gathered for Megan's funeral and celebrated her life was excruciating. At least when Robbie and Chris were the suspects, they appeared to have a motive. But what would Donnie's motive be? Well, I could guess, and I'm sure you could too. Just 3 days after Donnie's DNA was put into CODIS, there was a match. Donnie was the major contributor to the male DNA that was found during Megan's autopsy. They pulled Donnie into an interview room, and Detective Dyer asked him if he had seen Megan on July 1st. Donnie said no. Dyer asked him if he had cheated on Naomi with Megan at any point, and Donnie said no. Dyer then asked if he ever dated or had a relationship with Megan or been in contact with her outside of that drive they took to school. Donnie said no. So then Dyer asked him, "Well then, why is your DNA found inside Megan's body?" And Donnie's face dropped. Yep, how are you going to explain that? That's when Donnie got really angry. He had been caught in a lie. He thought he was slick, that burning away the evidence would be enough to get away with this crime. He was so confident about giving his DNA sample, but he was wrong. However, Donnie wasn't done with his trail of lies. He then changed his story. I've heard this many times before. He said, "Oh wait, no. I did have sex with Megan, and it was consensual." And that just makes me sick to think about all that I know. Knowing everything that we know, there's no way Donnie said he had kept it a secret because he didn't want the detectives to pin Megan's murder on him. You would think Donnie's lies would be enough to arrest him, but no. Heineman and Dyer knew that the district attorney would not consider this to be solid enough evidence to make a case against him. All this would do would be to prove that he had sex with Megan. It doesn't prove he murdered her. Well, when Brittany found out about Donnie's claim that Megan consensually had sex with him, she was shocked. She said in no world did it make sense why Megan would have relations with a man that was 13 years older than her, especially when she had feelings for someone else and she was getting out of another relationship. But I do understand the police didn't want to make any assumptions based on Donnie's long history of arrests. They wanted to make sure they had the right man and ample evidence to back it up, because just because he was a criminal doesn't mean he committed this crime. Well, recall that they requested all of Megan's cell phone information. In addition, they put in a request for Donnie's cell phone data and GPS records. They also requested the burner phone records, as well as Timmy and Naomi's personal cell phones. Time was ticking away. They were almost to October now, but at least Kelly and Carrie could rest easier knowing that Donnie was behind bars. However, Megan's case was still an open investigation. Heineman worked tirelessly to find another connection between Donnie and Megan. Sometimes, Kelly would text Hinman at 2 or 3 a.m. with questions about her daughter's case, and he reassured her and gave her as much information as he could. On October 26th, A graduation ceremony was held for the 18 nursing students in Megan's class at the Highland Hills Church of Christ. A seat was decorated in Megan's honor, and Kelly accepted an honorary degree in Megan's name. Kelly said in an interview that it was bittersweet. She said that Megan had worked so hard for this and now she would never become a nurse. Megan's friends who graduated with her and did become nurses said that they would carry on Megan's legacy. It wasn't until November that the cell phone results came back. All the data from the GPS towers had been plotted in points on a map, showing the movement of Megan, Donnie, Timmy, and Naomi's phones on the 1st of July. Officers thought that Timmy was involved, but the only time Timmy was near the burner phone was on the day he bought it. Naomi's phone records showed that on the night of the 1st, she was across town, nowhere near Donnie's phone, or the burner phone, or her house. She was at work, so they did not believe that Naomi was involved. Heinemann noted that on June 30th, while Megan worked at the steakhouse, their burner phone placed a call to Megan's old cell phone. Later, there was an outgoing call between Megan's current phone and the burner phone. Donnie's phone was in the same GPS location as the burner, which means Donnie was the one calling Megan. Now they knew that it had to be him who crafted this elaborate story about needing someone to take care of his elderly grandmother, giving Megan a fake address and promising to give her money up front for this lucrative job that she just couldn't turn down. On the afternoon of July 1st, there was another outgoing call from Megan's current phone to the burner phone, around the same time that Megan was supposed to arrive at that fake location off the so-called 850 Schaefer Road. The GPS data converged. It was clear Donnie abducted Megan, most likely at gunpoint, forced her into his vehicle and drove southeast. The phones lingered at 2 other locations, the place in Franklin County where Megan's body was found, and another location near Winchester on the outskirts of a farm. Now Heinemann put 2 and 2 together and figured the farm was where Megan must have been forced into intercourse and murdered. By the way, there's your motive. Sickening and heartless. A woman treated as disposable because of a man's desire. Detective Heyman drove out to this location, the farm where he suspected Megan had been killed. There's a secluded road that leads to a gate and onto this farm, and guess who this farm belonged to? The Jones family. Heinemann found a field on the edge of a river that would be a great camping spot, with a fire pit and a burn barrel. Burn barrels are large. They're made of metal and are used to get rid of trash and natural debris without putting those things in the landfill. It's safer than burning things out in the open. At the bottom of that barrel, detectives found burnt scraps of a thin black and purple scarf patterned with stars, and that actually made me tear up when I saw it. Heyman brought this scarf back to Megan's mother and sister, and Carrie said it was Megan's. Carrie had actually given it to Megan as a present. Carrie and Kelly felt it in their hearts that Megan deliberately let that scarf fall from her neck and left it there as a clue. Remember, she liked to watch true crime, so it could be true that she knew in her final moments it would lead back to her and her killer. Donnie might have tried to burn away the evidence, but Megan was smart enough to leave behind bits and pieces to lead the police to Donnie. Look at the scarf, look at the handwritten note. Without a doubt, Donnie did this, and now we know that Robbie and Chris were innocent. They had secrets, but they were still young and trying to figure out what they wanted in life, and they both cared deeply about Megan. On November 15th of 2012, Donnie was charged with aggravated kidnapping, forced intercourse, and first-degree murder. He was transferred to the Franklin County Jail, where he was held without bail. Thank goodness for technology, because without that phone data and GPS, we wouldn't have put these connections together. But the phone data couldn't explain why and how Donnie targeted Megan. Did he ask his wife for Megan's phone number? Did he actually search through Naomi's phone looking for targets? Well, we know he was with Megan in his car the year before. That's all it took for this man to want to have his way with her, and he didn't care what extreme he had to go to in order to get what he wanted. It's disgusting. Even with all the evidence against him, Donnie's preliminary hearing was marked by his plea of not guilty. Not even a surprise to me, but District Attorney Mike Taylor built a case against him. There was zero evidence that Naomi knew anything about Donnie's actions, but they didn't need Naomi's testimony. The contents of the burner phone were enough to tell the full story. In the week Donnie owned that burner phone, he had messaged not 1, not 2, but dozens of young women. Attorney Taylor tracked down these women and realized that every single one was a nurse. They were either still in school, working at a nursing home, or doing hospice or home services. Donnie would contact these women, offering them caretaking jobs with upfront pay and a false address. It was all a scheme to lure these poor women to their deaths. Taylor was never able to find Megan's phone or the murder weapon. He also never publicly recommended Donnie for the death penalty because, after 7 months, Donnie chose to plead guilty. On February 4, 2013, Donnie was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Megan's mother, Kelly, had been the main spokesperson for her entire family, trying to keep Megan's name alive through this very dehumanizing process. We sometimes forget that these victims are human. She said that she didn't believe in the word justice. She didn't think it applied to Megan's case. At least Kelly said, justice is a word for the world, not for families of victims. It's sad, but it's true. The sentencing was a relief, but a month later, Donnie filed paperwork to rescind his guilty plea. Yes, he did. Kelly called him a coward. Donnie claimed his lawyer had forced him to plead guilty and that he could easily prove he was in another location when Megan's murder occurred. Really? How? How are you going to do that? What proves that he was in a different location when your cell phone, the thing that landed you behind bars, is tracking with the burner phone and the victim's phone? Donnie was selfish, and for Megan's family, it felt like this nightmare would never end. Kelly and Carrie funded the construction of a meditation garden in Megan's honor. It was somewhere that Kelly went to decompress and to think about her daughter. Brittany and the rest of Megan's friend group got star tattoos on their feet and behind their ears. Then, they commissioned artist Bob Clemens to construct a memorial at Megan's final resting place. Instead of just putting a cross on the side of the road, which Kelly felt would be meaningful but not unique to Megan, Bob created a 7-foot-tall sculpture. It rotates with the wind and is made with 24 silver metal stars. It turns out Bob didn't even know that Megan was 24 years old. It was just a coincidence. But if you believe in fate, I think this sculpture is exactly what Megan would have wanted, and her family said that as well.